Oh, hello. Didn't see you there. Well, you caught us at the perfect time yet again. It is that time of the year. It is time to be spooky. It's the month of October, horror month, spooky month, whatever you know it as. It is the time that those kind of games, themes, they all come out. Now, plenty of people look at more modern horror games or even mid, early, late 2000s horror games. Well, I thought I'd look at a series that really started it all. One from the early 90s all the way up to the mid 2000s. And I thought I'd look at Alone in the Dark.
While we had horror-themed games in the past, such as Splatterhouse and even Castlevania, we didn't really have any true survival horror games. We had Sweet Home on NES, which would be a precursor to Resident Evil, but it was really Alone in the Dark that was the one bringing it to the mainstream audience. This game is actually credited for making the survival horror genre even possible.
So yeah, let's look at Alone in the Dark, the grandfather of horror games on the PC, released in 1992, a while ago.
Now, I don't actually physically own the game, since it is rather a collector's item now. I will be playing the version on Steam, which runs in DOSBox, actually. So, Alone in the Dark, you start the game up and you're able to choose one of two characters. Edward Carnby, the series protagonist and private investigator, and Emily Hartwood, who nobody ever plays as. Once you choose, you are greeted to this nice intro where the player is driven up to this great-looking mansion. You drive past a frog, and something is even staring at you through the window when you walk into the mansion. You see, the story of Alone in the Dark, it takes place in 1924. A man named Jeremy Hartwood commits suicide in his mansion. This mansion is said to be haunted and evil and spooky and all that great stuff. Well, after some time, nobody really cares about the dude anymore. Regardless of the character you choose, you're sent in to investigate this piano. Well, after you get there and investigate some piano in the attic, you realize that this mansion certainly has some bad mojo going on with it. So it's up to you to get the hell out of the mansion and figure out what's causing all this evil stuff from happening. That's the basic gist of the plot, and I think it's actually set up in a rather intriguing way, actually. I think for the time, Spooky Mansion was pretty good, and I think the whole idea of this haunted power causing all this evil stuff to happen is quite good. Naturally, the plot progresses quite a bit as you go throughout the game. Throughout the game, you find books and notes to read that give a lot more insight about the evil being that really controls this place. Luckily, none of these are ever too long. The story actually gets really interesting if you read some of these notes, but I doubt you will at this point in time, so I'll just leave it at evil spirit goes into tree, wants to use your body as host to unleash evil. Well, I made it sound pretty generic there and bland, but trust me, there is a lot more to it than that. I may have just undersold the story a bit, but I think it is one of the stronger aspects of the original Alone in the Dark. The whole mystery portion of it is quite good, and would pretty much go on to be a staple of survival horror games, where there is this underlying mystery, and part of the horror, and just part of the entire game really, is figuring out what is going on and solving said mystery. So it was really innovative for the time, that's for sure. I think the premise, of course, is pretty basic nowadays, but it was good for the time, and the lore is a nice touch. I think that the world that is presented has a decent amount of thought put into it, which really isn't present in video games nowadays. The story is very gothic and inspired by H.P. Lovecraft, so that's always a plus. The inner goth in me loves it. One aspect of the story that I will say is actually on the weaker side is the characters themselves. I think the main character, regardless of who you play as, is really quite generic and bland. The initial intro is like the only details you actually get about your character and the only depth they get at all. Once you start the game, that's it really. There is nothing. I would say Jeremy, the guy who died, gets way more depth and personality from the notes than the main character. The antagonist of the game also doesn't really have any personality, to be honest. There is lore and history with him, that's cool and all. I just didn't find much character to these characters. The most character the main character gets is at the end of the game when they get out and jump for joy. Speaking of the end, the ending is quite funny and basic as they get out of the mansion and are greeted to a skeleton driving the car the character just got in. Man, what a really weird Uber.
Man, I don't care where we're going. Just get me out of here, actually.
Alright, man. Location set to anywhere but here and Wendy's. Sounds good.
You know, actually, Wendy's sounds pretty good. That house back there, all I got was like biscuits and some like gravy. It was shit. Let's get some Wendy's. Yeah.
Oh, really? Okay, you know what? Fine. Let's go. Did I get bacon jalapeno fries with no bacon?
Okay, enough about the story of Alone in the Dark. While it doesn't have the best characters, I still think the story is quite good here. The intrigue is nice, and I think everything wraps up quite nicely. But this is a game, so how does the game play? So Alone in the Dark plays like your typical survival horror game from the mid-90s to early 2000s. The game uses tank controls and has fixed camera angles in the house, similar to a point-and-click game. The game does not use the mouse, and you use the arrow keys in the spacebar and the enter button. That is it. So let's go over what the player can do in the game first, and start with navigation. Just in case someone on planet Earth doesn't know what tank controls are, this means you only move forward. If you want to turn direction, you literally have to turn the character to face that direction, then press up to make them move in that direction. Pressing back makes you walk backwards. Okay, hopefully you understand. This game is structured around this movement for the most part and uses fixed camera angles that change angle depending on where you are in the room. These would become some staples of the survival horror genre, and they were created right here in Alone in the Dark. So after this review, I'm never explaining tank controls or fixed camera angles again. Okay, so your character can move, but they can actually run as well if you double tap up. More on that in a few minutes. Then we get into the actions and interactions your character can do. Unlike modern games, or even most games, there's no context button. See, what you have is the spacebar, which is your action button. When you press enter, you see your menu. On here you see your items, but you also see your actions. These include fight, push, open/search, and then later in the game jump. You then select one of these actions. After you've selected the action, pressing the spacebar will perform said action. For instance, in the first room in the game, there's a wardrobe. If you want to see what's inside it, which is an important item by the way, you want to select the open/search, then hold spacebar when you're next to it. However, if you want to push the wardrobe to prevent the monster from coming in through the window, you select on your action list push. Then you can push the wardrobe by holding spacebar. Another basic example would be the chest that's in the same room. If you want to push it, you have to go to the push action on the menu, and if you want to open it, you have to do the search action on the menu, and then, search it. Certain items also have become their own actions for certain objects. Really, it's just keys though. You choose the key as your action, walk up to whatever you need to unlock, hold the space bar, and you'll unlock whatever there is to unlock. It really caught someone like me by surprise, as I just walked up to the chest that I know I had the key for and couldn't open it. It was like, no, I actually had to have the key set to my action button, then I could open the chest. It's really quite archaic, and it's really old school, and it's different, but it just makes me honestly appreciate modern games even more. Like, having to actually select the key as your action and then performing the action is just an extra step that would get eliminated in Resident Evil. The next thing the player can do is fight. If you have fight selected, of course, as your action, and you hold spacebar, you go into a fight stance there, or you can press the arrow keys to do attacks when you're holding spacebar. You can punch and even do a kick, but it's pretty basic stuff, as it's probably obvious that fighting isn't exactly the best in the game. You also get some weapons throughout the game, such as a sword and even some guns, and it's the same thing where you have to go into the stance and then use the arrow keys. It's quite slow, it's heavily delayed, it's really cumbersome. I would argue it's some of the slowest combat I've ever seen in any video game, period. But this kind of combat had never really even been seen before, to be honest. It's not exactly the best, and it will come up later in this review. I guess the last thing to mention about the player themselves is the inventory. This is obviously a huge staple of the survival horror genre, and it's in full force here. Inventory management is essential in the game. The inventory is highly limited, and the player must often discard items to make room for more. The amount of space you have in your inventory is actually based off of weight, not a number of items. For instance, a knife weighs basically nothing, so you could carry 5 of those, but a heavy statuette would weigh just as much. And once you're maxed out on item space, you'll have to drop stuff. Once you drop stuff though, it's not gone forever, it's just on the floor, and you could pick it back up anytime you want, even if you leave the area. Items in the game include weapons, keys, books, notes, records, and of course medkits. You don't regenerate health in the game, and you don't actually have a set amount of health either. You start the game with 20 health, but you can get it as high as you want actually. You just gotta find the medkits hidden in the game and use them. I'll be honest, I think there's only 3, maybe 4 medkits in the whole game. so whenever you find one, I would just use it immediately. Certain enemies do more damage than others, but you generally don't want to get hit that much. But I mean, it's a survival horror game. They are going to hit you eventually, and you probably know eventually you're going to die. Luckily, you can save the game at literally any point. You just pause the game, click save, that's it. I would save a lot because there's a number of traps in this game, especially first-time players. For instance, there is a book that if you read, it actually instantly kills you. I'm not kidding. It actually instantly kills you. Like, what the hell?
You know, guys, I'll be honest, I've gotten pretty tired of reviewing games. I think every YouTuber reviews games. Let's do something different. Let's review a video game manual, a book, if you will. Now, in this book, on page 1,
Well, that certainly wouldn't make any sense in real life, but yeah, my point is to save often. But that is for what your character can do, so it's time to go over the general gameplay. You're exploring this house in a mostly non-linear fashion, getting clues, solving puzzles, and fighting off monsters. I mean, this game basically created the survival horror genre, so it established the tropes here. You'll often be searching every single object in a room in the mansion looking for a certain item. Once you find said item, either the player character interacts with it, or you use it on the environment. Once you finish the first couple rooms in the mansion, the whole mansion actually becomes explorable, and you can explore your way around, solving puzzles in a quite non-linear fashion, and this is something a lot of survival horror games struggle with. In a lot of survival horror games, they make you go down a certain path, and go a certain way, and solve the puzzle in a certain way, and you do all this in a certain order. But the original Alone in the Dark, you can actually solve puzzles out of order, air quotes here, and it's just something different. For instance, when you finally get down to the first floor, you could check out what's going on in the kitchen, or you could try to get these arrows and fight off these crazy spiders. It's kind of interesting as there are actually quite a number of non-linear elements. Of course, the game isn't crazy open. It's not like an open world or even not non-linear or anything. It's just you can do some of the puzzles and interactions in a different order, which means if you replay the game, you could do certain puzzles before other ones, adding to replayability. The puzzles themselves are pretty standard for the genre. Find keys, use keys, special item, use special item, push something to find hidden area. It's basic stuff. I didn't think any of the puzzles were that challenging. I don't think you'll ever really be scratching your head. I will say that there are a few items that you will need to hang on to for quite a while in the game, and there is no indication of what you actually need to hang on to and what is not needed at all. So if you drop something at a certain part in the house and then you need it, you're going to have to go back and get it. You're going to have to remember where you even dropped it. Something interesting is after you use items, you still actually have to discard them. For instance, using a medkit will now just have an empty medkit, so you actually have to discard it. It's not automatically done like in every other game ever made, especially after this. The next thing to mention in the game is the enemies. There is actually a variety of enemies in the game, and while I can't honestly tell you what a number of them are, just look at them, I just couldn't tell you. I can tell you there's zombies, rats, and these weird bird things. I'd say like 90% of the enemies really just rush you and just try to kill you as fast as they can with melee attacks. They all really have the same strategy to defeat. Either beat them up with your hands or a melee weapon, or just pull out a firearm and get them. There is, to my knowledge, only 2 ranged enemies in the game, and one of them is the final boss. Now, while a lot of the enemies can be defeated, there are a decent number of them that can actually not be defeated. These actually need to be just avoided altogether. For instance, these ghosts, if you touch them, they just turn into giant swirling balls and will actually kill you instantly. Or this giant worm, it kills you instantly, and you need to dodge it. Some enemies you actually have to use items on to kill, meaning that there is a puzzle element to this as well, which is a nice change of pace from just fighting the regular enemies, because fighting the regular enemies kind of sucks. They really love to shove you in a corner and basically stun lock you due to the delayed combat. There is even a special boss fight in the game against a pirate. Yeah, a pirate with a sword, and you get into a sword fight with him, and this is actually pretty cool, and it's definitely the highlight of the combat in the entire game. That's the main gameplay for Alone in the Dark, but I think I'll mention the very last portion of the game as well. The last portion of the game actually becomes extremely linear. This is when you go under the house and you actually have to do platforming. Yes, you have to do actual platforming. It's not automatically done or anything either. It's just as bad as it looks. There's even this basically pitch black maze that is just absolutely delightful for a game with these graphics. Yeah. In fact, that's enough of the gameplay. Let's head on over to the graphics of the game. Looking at this game in 2019, well, it looks like fucking shit, to be honest. But let's take our modern contact lenses out and put on the nostalgia goggles. I say that, but this game is actually older than me. But we're putting the nostalgia goggles on regardless. The game was the first, or at least one of the first PC games to actually use polygons as opposed to sprites. So when it came out in 1992, it looked quite fantastic and was actually highly praised. The backgrounds are basically pre-rendered, but they're pretty flat in all honesty. I would say they are just short of being really nice pre-rendered backgrounds, and you do interact with them a bit, but yeah, they're pre-rendered. These backgrounds are probably the best though in terms of aging. They aren't too blurry and actually look moderately decent for the time. And I'll say they have a nice amount of detail actually in the house, which looks great for the time and looks the part. And I certainly love at the end how it gets all gothic and mysterious, but I will say the rest of the game has not aged that well graphically. The models look particularly bad, as I could probably count on two hands how many polygons are used for the models. It's just a low polygon count, there's nothing else to it. And like I said, it was great for the time, but it's aged very poorly. However, if you want the true experience, you can set this YouTube video to 240p and that's the true experience right there. The animation is just terrible in all honesty. I'm sure for the time it was good, but even compared to games that came out relatively around the same time that used polygons, such as the original Star Fox, which came out within a few years of this, it just looks like crap. The attacking animations are just goofy in all honesty, and the enemies just move in a weird manner due to the low frames. Speaking of frames, we got the frame rate here, and we got my guy Frame Rater. It seemed smooth enough, and I never saw a drop. The frames on the animation, like I said, it wasn't great, but overall the frame rate was fine. The graphics are definitely a product of its time. Like, the lighting is basically non-existent, and that's the best way of putting it. It's a product of its time. It's aged terribly, but for 1992 it was great, so take that as you will. Let's move on to the sound, which is aged way better. The sound is actually quite good in the game, especially for the time. There is no voice acting past the very first screen when you're choosing a character, and that's not even honestly enough for me to even comment on. For the rest of the game, the character just makes grunts, groans, moans, I don't know. There is the music that plays in the game, usually when an enemy is nearby, but it doesn't happen too often. But when it does, I think it's actually good, and it sets the mood quite well. As opposed to being catchy or happy, it's dark, broody, and more atmospheric than anything else. It's all about the mood, and you definitely get that because basically in a battle where some of these creatures can just kick your ass. So I thought it was really good in that aspect. It also doesn't get totally worn out because the music only plays when enemies show up. It doesn't just play in an endless cycle, which is nice. So there are plenty of parts of the game where there's no music at all, just sound effects. Speaking of the sound effects, they are pretty good. Everything has a really crunchy, menacing sound effect. Stuff like your character walking, the noises the monsters make, the ripping of flesh, glass shattering. It's all great here. Despite it being such an old game, it just honestly has some somewhat terrifying noises, I'm not gonna lie. The sound design is something Alone in the Dark just gets. It really adds to the atmosphere. With the graphics lack, the sound makes up for it, in my opinion. Everything is tense, that's for sure, which is exactly what you would want in a game like this.
While the game might be tense in some aspects, it's not always for the right reasons, and let's just get right into those reasons, and let's start with the controls of the game.
Yeah, the controls, like I brought up earlier, aren't exactly that great. They're functional and are fine when you're just trying to walk around and explore stuff. It's just tank controls. It's when you go into combat it really has some issues. Besides being ridiculously slow and cumbersome, it is also just like agonizingly sluggish. It takes forever to do attacks, like an entire second of windup. What this leads to is if you don't hit the enemy first and they hit you, and you push back a little, there is a good chance that they're just going to continuously attack you because you can't honestly attack fast enough. You'll just get stun locked. It's extremely sluggish. It takes forever to fight back, and you'll probably almost be dead by the time you can if you actually even manage to get a hit back after it's hit you. You need to strike first like 90% of the time. With the guns, it's just about as bad because it takes forever to shoot a gun. It makes the game honestly more tense because you know you can just get absolutely screwed over and killed very easily. But I'll be honest, this is tense for the wrong reasons. Running is also a problem, as you're supposed to double tap on the up arrow, but this never works right. I feel like I never got the hang of it, and it just kind of worked randomly. I would double tap it, but it wouldn't work half the time. But regardless, it is tense despite the age, but jankiness is a large part of it. The combat, I would have to say, is aged worse than anything else in this game, even the graphics. And that is saying something. I mean, look at the detail, or rather lack of detail, on the main character's face. Speaking of the graphics, while I already talked about them, I'm going to talk about an issue I had with them, which is that in certain camera angles, everything just gets way too pixely. Like, I need to zoom in a bit because it just gets to the point where I can't even see like what I'm doing. I can't make out pixels. It's really ridiculous. It only happened a few times, but it's just like, dude, I can't even see what I'm doing. I can barely see where I am. I can't even fight the enemy. Then at the very end of the game, well, that's something else. There is this pitch black maze that I brought up earlier, and this thing just sucks. It's really annoying, it's confusing, it's very slow, and again it has the issue of everything being pixely, like I can barely see anything. How am I supposed to know that that's a door? Speaking of which, the last part of the game is easily the weakest part of the game, minus the final boss. The platforming is really just as bad as it looks, it's super jank, and it just doesn't work very well. It's really awkward, the camera angle is awkward, it's just not good, period. It's also strangely incredibly linear and more action focused. I just didn't like it as much as the mansion, but in all fairness it is over rather quickly. And that's something I could say about the game, it is over rather quickly. I finished the game in about 2.5, maybe 3 hours. I've seen walkthroughs finish the game in about 50 minutes, and I'm sure I'm the average person. It'd probably take around 3.5 hours to beat the game, so there really isn't that much to it in terms of length. But overall, I would say it was a pretty good, or like 3 hours at least. Then I did have a good time with it. Overall, the gameplay is certainly a good trip back to the past, and it's not one of the shitty games that suck ass. It's a classic through and through.
So in conclusion, Alone in the Dark, the original, it was a fun time. It was a pretty good game still. And you know what, I definitely had a good time playing it. It's a true classic, that's for sure. It's got some positives and some negatives. And it's certainly not going to be scaring you in this day and age with its dated graphics and lackluster controls and combat. But it's got a good atmosphere, it's got a good story, and it's really got some great sound design. The game would be a smash hit, actually, and basically went on to inspire every survival horror game after. So if you like survival horror, there is really little to no reason why you should not play the game. Sure, it's dated and old, but I mean, what isn't eventually? And I had a good time with it. So, next time, we're going to be looking at the sequel, Alone in the Dark 2, released a year later. Caught us at the perfect time. We're looking at the second Alone in the Dark now, in this Alone in the Dark series critical analysis retrospective review thing. And now, the second Alone in the Dark was released a year later. Yeah, after the big success of the original Alone in the Dark, they pumped out a sequel a year later. They were getting to it. They wanted a second game. And it was actually released a number of years later on the PlayStation, which is the version I'm going to look at today, not the original PC version. Let's get into it.
So yes, I've got it on my PlayStation Classic, let's get into it. That means I won't have analog control, but I played the first game with literally the arrow keys, so I'm fine. The PlayStation 1 port of the game is known as Alone in the Dark, One-Eyed Jack's Revenge. This game was also ported to the Sega Saturn under the same name. The original game, though, it's just known as Alone in the Dark 2. The PlayStation 1 version has updated graphics and apparently has more voice acting, but in terms of gameplay or small additions or improvements or refinements, there isn't actually, so yeah, there doesn't seem to be any. But yeah, let's get into the sequel to Alone in the Dark. So Alone in the Dark 2 takes place, I guess, a bit after the first game, 3 months actually. You boot the game up and you're greeted to this introduction. Carnby is still a private investigator and has a partner named Ted Stryker. The two of them are investigating a missing girl by the name of Grace. After some investigation, they find out she is in this mansion named Hell's Kitchen. The mansion is known to be home to a ton of gangsters. While Stryker sneaks into the mansion, however, he is attacked by this woman named Elizabeth, who seems to have superpowers. He's actually just killed in the intro. So there goes Carnby's partner. You then get this just awful menu screen. Like, it looks just ridiculously generic, but I guess it's better than the DOS menu, like of the original. You can choose between 3 difficulties, however, it doesn't actually seem like they actually do anything. Someone can correct me if I'm wrong, of course, but it doesn't seem like they do anything, so I played on normal. Then you start the game. You see Carnby show up at the mansion 2 days later on Christmas Eve of all days. Who would have thought Alone in the Dark 2 was a Christmas game, actually? Well, you roll up to the mansion and are immediately jumped by a ton of gangsters. There are literally gangsters everywhere. After getting away from them, Carnby finds out that his partner was killed, and, well, he seems a little pissed off. He needs to rescue Grace, the little girl. And that is the general plot synopsis of the game. Like, at first glance kind of look, yeah. The story is honestly just not as good as the originals. I really liked how simple the original game had its story. You went into a spooky mansion to investigate, found out some evil spirit thing was still haunting it, causing all these monsters to come back. Here it starts out way more complicated, which isn't bad, but it's just kind of unnecessary. I don't really like the premise, in all honesty. Like, it's okay, but I just don't think it's anything past a decent setup here, and it pales in comparison to the originals. It's just not a more is better situation here. The introduction of Grace and having to save her was decent, but I just don't ever feel like it went anywhere meaningful. She literally just shows up when you find her. Like, it doesn't have any impact, any emotion, there's just nothing here. It was very lacking. The big twist in the game is that these aren't actually gangsters. They're actually pirates, or were pirates, back when they could be relevant as pirates, and they sold their souls in order to live eternally. So they literally just live forever and have become gangsters. Jack is actually the leader of them, and Elizabeth is basically second in command and is able to do some voodoo magic, as the game puts it, allowing her to take control of people and fling them around. The pirate twist was a decent enough plot twist, I thought. I thought it was cool, and it was a real showcase when Jack actually reveals his backstory and Elizabeth reveals her backstory, as these are the biggest information dumps in the entire game. And I actually really like the backstory. I think it's one of the strongest parts of the entire game. The backstory that is given to the villains was actually quite decent. They're somewhat interesting, have good motives, and they're just not as generic as I want to take over the world antagonists. It's a large step up from the previous game's villain, but in doing so I think some of the intrigue is gone. I mean, they literally tell you everything and don't leave anything vague on purpose. But honestly, it leaves for a better villain in the end. It is one of the few aspects where I think it's much better than the originals. It's the villains. Like how Jack killed the Flying Dutchman. That was cool. One issue I find is that the villains are so fleshed out actually, and they're actually good, it really makes a stark contrast for Edward and Grace. They have little to no personality. Edward has a little bit more than the originals, but in the originals he was fairly basic. Here, there's a little bit more, and there's a little bit more of, I guess, personal stakes, but he really just comes off as generic for the most part. I didn't feel any attachment to him at all, and it wasn't to the point where I was able to even insert myself, as he's clearly a character. He was just a boring character. And it's all the more obvious when the villains are actually good and given some character and personality. Grace, on the other hand, really does nothing the entire game and shows little to no personality other than being a little girl. There's just nothing there in terms of character. So while I don't think the premise and location are as interesting, I think the pirate twist is still good. It's not a story that falls flat as a whole. I think the villains really save it, the pirates make it a bit better, but if it wasn't for those, the story would fall flat on its face. I'm in the mansion. I've already done this in the first game. There's a secret cave under the mansion, which again has already been done in the first game, and the two main characters are about as interesting as a stick of butter, really. To conclude my opinion on the story, I think it's serviceable and is just average to slightly above average at best. But I do like the original game's premise and story more. I like the creepier, mystery-focused story that this game just doesn't have. But enough about that. Let's look at the gameplay. So the gameplay is basically identical to the original game. You play as Edward and as Grace a few times. I will go over Edward first. He plays basically identical to how he did in the original game. There is tank control still, and you can still run. However, I will say that on the PlayStation version, running has actually been mapped to a button as opposed to double tapping, which is much appreciated. This is much better than the original games, so kudos to them for improving that. You still have to select what action you're going to do on a menu and press the action button. The two actions are now attack and push. There's not really an interact button, as if you just kind of walk up to stuff, and if it's interactable, it kind of automatically does. It just happens when you press X, when you interact with it. There's like a real interact button, but I know that's only on the PlayStation version. And if you have an item, it's like how it was in the first game, where you're going to have to equip the item and then press the action button to perform that action. So nothing is done really automatically for you still, just if you want to search, you can press the button to search. The combat is exactly the same as the first games, where it's still very slow, you have to get into the stance, and every attack is delayed. You have to aim weapons for shooting for them, which takes like a full second. It's not instant, and literally nothing has changed here at all. It's not any worse than the originals, but the originals was awful in all honesty, and this game does nothing to fix it. Expect me to bring this up later in more detail, that's for sure. The weapons you get are pretty similar to the first games as well. You get a Tommy gun, a rifle, a pistol, and melee weapons, but those are basically just swords. And of course you can attack with your fists. Edward doesn't really have anything new from the last game. He doesn't lose anything either, besides the interaction button, as that's done automatically when you press the X button. The only change you get is that running is its own button, but both of these that I just mentioned are only on the PlayStation version. So let's look at the other playable character, Grace, the little girl. She can't open doors because she's too small, so she crawls around a lot and can't do anything else except use items with the environment. She is agonizingly slow, and it's just not as much fun to play as her, especially compared to Edward. She's not in a whole lot of the game, but she is in a bit. With the two playable characters out of the way, let's talk about the environment. So the environment is again very similar to the first game. A majority of the environment is a rather large mansion. There's plenty of rooms to explore, nooks and crannies, and secrets. I will say, though, that you do spend a good amount of time actually outside of the mansion. There's this giant garden, a backyard, that you'll spend a decent amount of time in. There is the giant cave, like I mentioned, which is similar to the first games, and there's even a pirate ship down there. The pirate ship is probably the best environment in the game, as it's really the only truly new environment. It was also the only environment that I generally found any fun exploring, and I'll explain why in a bit. The enemies in the game are significantly different from the original game. There are really two types of enemies. You can only fight them as Edward. If you're Grace, they'll just immediately come and grab you and you'll get a game over. The two enemies of the game are enemies with guns and enemies not with guns. The ones with guns look like mobsters and will just light you up on sight. It's literally just fate on sight. And the ones that aren't are pirates that will immediately rush you with their pirate swords. That's it. All the unique, different, interesting, creepy monsters from the last game, they're gone. They're just totally gone in favor of pirates, really. And while I do say I actually like the pirate enemies, I think it's a nice change of pace for games in general, just because there's not enough games, honestly, with pirates in it. And the best pirate game, I think, is a game with the word assassins in it. They're actually kind of fun to fight in this game. The gangsters, though, no, not at all. So what will you really be doing in Alone in the Dark 2? Well, it's really like the first game, to a T. You'll be solving puzzles, exploring the area, picking up items, using said items with other items in the environment to solve even more puzzles. You'll be fighting a bunch of enemies along the way. It's very similar to the first game, and it's just kind of how survival horror games were in the 90s. I will say that the non-linear style of gameplay that was present in the original Alone in the Dark is completely gone. You have to do all the puzzles in a certain order, a certain way, or you won't complete it. That simple. In the original game, you were usually given a couple puzzles you could solve at a time and could go in any order you want, but not here. It's very linear, very straight to the point, that's for sure. In the original game, you actually had to manage your inventory quite a lot, and you had to frequently drop stuff all over the place because you didn't have any space for it. Additionally, when an item was used, it would still be in your inventory and it would just be empty or used, and you'd still have to drop it. Both of those aspects have been removed. You can just carry as many items as you want now, and you'll never even slow down. Also, items are discarded automatically when they're used. That much is nice. Getting rid of the item management, I don't know how I feel about that one. It's a double-edged sword. While it is kind of tedious to manage your inventory, I thought it really made you strategize what you wanted to pick up and made you only carry important stuff. But also, it could take up a bit of time, that's for sure. But when you can just carry everything, you carry literally everything, and you'll be scrolling through your entire inventory trying to find that one item you knew you picked up at some point. It could have even been hours ago. Either way, it's kind of tedious, and both sides have pros and cons, so I'm just going to leave it at that and let you decide. Now, I guess the last thing to mention would be when you play as Grace. And there is a small level of stealth since you don't want to get spotted by the pirates. You can actually make some booby traps with some of the items you get in the game, but this happens maybe once or twice, honestly. It's barely even worth bringing up. I just brought it up because I know somebody will bring it up if I don't. One thing that is nice in the original game is that you could save anywhere, and that actually comes back. Yeah, even on the PlayStation, you can save literally everywhere, which is nice. And you'll be saving a lot because there are a lot of traps and just instant fail/death moments in the game. The gameplay really doesn't change that much from the original game as a whole. I won't even say it really builds on it either. It's really more of a lateral move than anything else. And the same can actually be said about the graphics. Here is the original Alone in the Dark 2 for comparison, and it looks literally exactly the same as the original Alone in the Dark. So if you want my thoughts on those graphics, you can watch the video I made on the original game. So for the graphics, I'll be reviewing the PlayStation versions. I'll be honest, these graphics are very poor. Even for the time, they were just very poor. While they were obviously a boost in quality from the original games, they're just not up to snuff with games from 1996. The most obvious comparison here would be Resident Evil, and I just think Resident Evil looks way better than this game in almost every aspect. And of course Resident Evil 1 looks very dated nowadays, but this game just looks even more dated. Like, it looks like a PlayStation 1 launch title. The game uses fully pre-rendered backgrounds, and these don't look terrible. Some have argued that the original Alone in the Dark backgrounds, they were a bit stale and did feel a bit samey. But there's no way you'll get that feeling with this one because all the environments look very different from each other, that's for sure. And I will say they actually look quite decent, especially for pre-rendered backgrounds. Like, alright. It's easily the best looking part of the graphics for sure. They have a nice amount of detail. They've actually aged quite decently, and I never found myself questioning what something was because of poor quality on the background. Everything was clear, and that's all I can really ask, honestly. I think the pre-rendered backgrounds were fine. It's everything else in the graphics department that's just not aged well. The character models are just really bad. They look really poor, have a low amount of detail in the animation, and it's just bad. Edward, for instance, looks horrible. He doesn't even have like a face. He doesn't even have like hands either, and his animations are just stiff cardboard. Like, they just look silly. While the original Resident Evil didn't have the most detail on its models, and it looked a bit stiff, this game just looks even worse, and it came out after, actually. Like, at least they had distinguishable faces, and this game is just a garbled mess, and for a lot of the enemies and characters, Grace just looks terrible. Like, she doesn't have any hands, feet, wobbles all around. Like, it sucks. She literally bounces all over the place. The animation is just piss poor in this game. The enemies are the same. When it comes to complaints, they have a low amount of detail, they animate very stiffly, and I just really don't think it was up to snuff at the time. I think I actually prefer the original graphics because that makes sense. It came out in '93 and they were still decently innovative for using polygons at the time. This just looks like crap, in all honesty. The frame rate was fine, but some of the animation is super choppy, like I mentioned, so there's that. As a whole, the presentation just wasn't very good. When it comes to the sound, I will say it is good for the most part. I think the original game had really good sound design, and I think this game is actually able to maintain almost all of that. First off, I will say the music is much more prevalent in this game. In the original game, music would only play in the tense part of the game, like when an enemy showed up. But in this game, there's always music playing, and the music just changes when enemies show up or something gets tense. So while that tension of there being no music is gone, I will actually say I prefer this game when it comes to the music, because the music is surprisingly really good. A lot of it is catchy, a lot of it sets the mood as well, and I think it's actually just something really nice to listen to. It's not the most atmospheric and doesn't exactly set the tone, but I think it's still good. It comes down to personal preference. It's like, would you like really good, catchy music, or would you like atmospheric, slow, drawn-out music that sets the tone in your horror game? I'll take the former of those two options if you're asking me, but I do actually like the music, and I like the direction they took with the music. There's never really a part of the game without music playing, and in all honesty, that's fine with me. But that's only because I quite like the music in the game. I could see how someone not liking the music in the game would be mad. And there's music in the entire game, and wanting more horror-themed atmospheric pieces, there's not as many, to be honest, as the first game. But for me, I'm fine with it. The sound effects that are present in the game I think are okay enough. They're amazing for the most part. They're pretty impactful, and really they were just decent enough. I will say, however, the gun sounds rather weak and muffled. But at the end of the week, I mean, it's good for the sound. There's really nothing else to it. So while the music is pretty good, and I think the sound effects are more than decent enough, I cannot say the same about the voice acting. It's not just the PlayStation version that is voice acting. The original Alone in the Dark 2 has voice acting as well. The voice acting is unsurprisingly cheesy, overdone, and is everything you'd expect from a typical 90s voice acting job in a video game. The writing isn't actually half bad, and the voices themselves are decent enough. My problem is that the quality of these voices are horrible. It sounds like they're just using an awful mic on everyone, and it's just not clear quality that you would expect from voice acting in a video game, honestly. I can't really describe it that well, so here are some examples.
I could see the desk where the captain hid the duplicate to the iron's key. My spirit wandered. One-Eyed Jack heard my call for help. My soul guided. He and his crew would become...
So while the voice acting tries, it just isn't that great. The quality of the voice acting just isn't very clear or very good, but they did try. I was hoping maybe the PlayStation version that came out a number of years later would improve the voice acting, smooth it out, but no, they left it the same. And that's why I think the sound as a whole in Alone in the Dark 2, it's just good, not the excellent sound design from the first game. At least the music's actually pretty good.
So it seems like Alone in the Dark 2 is a pretty decent follow-up to the original Alone in the Dark. At least it's a good game, right? Well, I'm here to tell you that this is the part of the video where I tell you why I don't like the game, because in all honesty, I don't like Alone in the Dark 2, and let me explain my points here.
The original game didn't have the best controls. I will say it could be quite clunky and was pretty cumbersome overall. But you see, Alone in the Dark 2... no effort was made to make any of this better. Running has been mapped to a button, and that's the only thing that's different. Now, I played the original game with the arrow keys and the keyboard. I'm playing this one with the PlayStation controller without analog sticks. They both feel pretty similar when it comes to controls. In Alone in the Dark 1 and 2, they're both pretty horrible. But this is a sequel. I really expected them to improve it in some way, and they don't. In some cases, I feel like the controls might actually be even slower. I'm not even kidding. It might be just me, but it can feel even slower at times than the original games. The original Alone in the Dark had pretty bad combat, I'm not gonna lie. It was extremely rough around the edges, it was quite clunky, it was cumbersome, and it wasn't fun. But you see, there wasn't too much combat in the game, actually. In fact, a lot of the combat could be avoided entirely, and in some instances, fighting the enemies was a puzzle in itself. You didn't literally go into combat with them. If you fight every single enemy in the original game in combat, there's maybe like 10 in the entire game. I'm not exaggerating. There just wasn't that many. In this game, it's a completely different story. The introduction area of this game has more enemies in it than the entirety of the original Alone in the Dark game. There are so many enemies in it, it's not even funny. There is just way too many enemies for this style of game. We are talking upon dozens and dozens and dozens of enemies littered in this game, and it's just too much. I think basically everyone who played the original game can agree that the worst part of the game was the combat. So what did the sequel do? They emphasized the combat. They make you do combat more than anything else in this game. I'm not even exaggerating. You'll be fighting enemies more than you're even solving puzzles or exploring in this game. Whether you're fighting the pirates or the gangsters, it doesn't matter. You'll be fighting enemies all the time. You're really bombarded by enemies throughout the entire game. But I will say that these enemies are way worse than the original game's enemies. A majority of the enemies in this game, really all the enemies except in the last like 20 minutes of the game, have guns. Yeah, they have guns now. And I will just say, you are fade on sight immediately. The moment they see you, they will rush towards you and start shooting. And how do I put this? Fighting enemies in this game with guns is just horrendous. There's just no other way of putting it. It's absolutely awful. I despise any enemy in this game with a gun. What happens a majority of the time you fight an enemy with a gun is you get hit by them shooting at you. There's a very good chance you just get stun locked and you just repeat the animation of you getting shot over and over and over and over until you finally have either a chance to get away or the enemy has to reload. If you get shot before you can get an attack off on the enemy, you're going to lose a bit of health. It's just going to happen, and you'll get hit over and over and over again. To make up for this, they try to give you more health, and they give you way more healing items than the original game, but this just doesn't solve the problem. You get stun locked, they will just completely kick your shit in. Because Edward is so slow and cumbersome, you'll never be able to get an attack off if they start shooting at you. What you want to do is retreat, and you're going to have to get the jump on them and attack them first, because you can trap them in an animation as well. Using a gun in this game against the enemies with guns, for the most part, is just horrible. You have to shoot first, otherwise you won't be shooting at all, because it just takes way too long to shoot from a gun. The windup is ridiculous. What is a much more effective way of getting rid of enemies, I'm not kidding, is running at them full speed while they're shooting at you and just punching them. Sure, it takes forever to kill them by punching them, but they won't do too much damage to you if you're doing this. It's not completely stupid, it's absolutely ridiculously stupid. You can't just take them down with guns, you have to run at them and start punching them because shooting takes an eternity. So no, forget the guns, just punch them, it's your best hope. These controls and combat style are just not well suited to what the game throws at you at all. They throw in tons of enemies with guns, and you're going to have to take them all out one by one for the most part and try not to get hit or stun locked in a corner. I found myself absolutely abusing the game's AI on multiple occasions just to try to beat the game, because I would just get stun locked and killed almost immediately thanks to these cheap enemies. You better save all the damn time in this game because this game is hard. It's hard because you'll just walk into a room and just get completely owned by enemies, and it'll just keep happening. This game is not easy, and it's not due to legitimate difficulty or challenging enemies. It's the terrible controls, slow-ass animation, wind-up, that's just terrible, and it's just cheap. I'm not going to say I'm great at games, I'm not even going to say I'm good at these types of games, but I can tell you the controls just make this game extremely difficult. They did nothing to make the combat better than the original game, and actually made it significantly worse. And you know what? When you fight enemies that don't have guns near the end of the game, it's not actually terrible. It's just bad, not like really bad. It's like the original Alone in the Darks. It's just not very good. It's just not absolutely horrible like most of the game. It's a sliver though. Like the very end of the game is the only part where you fight enemies without guns. Otherwise, they have guns and shoot at you, and it's just awful. It's easily my biggest issue with the game as a whole. It's the awful combat. I think it basically single-handedly ruins the game, really. It's not like you can avoid the enemies, like in the original game. No, you can't. This game makes you fight, like, almost all of the enemies, to be honest. Like, this combat just brings my piss to a boil. It just frustrated me so much because of how stupid it is. How is this survival horror like? Why is this like an action game? This is a action game, it acts like, with survival horror gameplay elements and tank controls. This is awful. Oh god, it's just awful. In fact, this game goes out of its way to be less survival horror as a whole. It really goes towards being an action game with survival horror elements. I never felt tense in this game, once, or anything resembling a feeling that you should be getting from a survival horror game. Most of the time, the only feeling I got was frustration due to the bad combat. Like, the game still uses regular survival horror gameplay philosophies and designs. There's still the fixed camera angles, which are actually really annoying in this game. They change just way too frequently, disorienting the player, and some of the angles are just not good. They don't give you enough room to see. It's like, stop changing angles. I just want to see where I'm in a room, damn it. The item management is gone, a standard survival horror trait that Alone in the Dark created, by the way. There are not that many puzzles in the game, especially when compared to really any other survival horror game. There is quite a few puzzles that don't get me wrong, but there's just, like, way less than the original games. Like, it's not even comparable. Also, I just don't think they're that good either. Some of them are just really uninteresting. It's extremely linear with all the puzzles. You solve every puzzle in a row in a linear fashion, one by one. Nothing carries over from each puzzle. They're very isolated, and there's just nothing really brain-scratching here. The game even reuses these puzzles to an extent, since they reuse the same environments a number of times. I think the original game did puzzles far better than its sequel. I thought the original game did puzzles just fine. Like I also brought up, there is a part of the game where you play as Grace, and this is just horrible. The stealth mechanics, I don't even want to call them mechanics. It's just borderline random if a pirate sees you. And if he sees you, well, you better just run, but he'll probably catch you anyway. Like, it's literally just random. I couldn't find any rhyme or reason. There's no indication if he sees you or doesn't see you. It's just random, and I have no other reason to believe otherwise. She's also ridiculously slow, and her puzzles involve backtracking to an earlier part of the game, and I just didn't like playing as Grace at all. I brought up much earlier that you'll be saving pretty frequently, and I mean that. Not only because of the horrible combat, the enemies kicking your shit in, but there's also so many traps in this game, and while I think a number of them are fine in a game like this, I think the original game perfectly did this, and I think Alone in the Dark 2 just goes way overboard, as there's so many parts where you just die instantly. It's like, okay, how the hell would I have known that? You'll be saving the game frequently and then loading saves even more frequently. It's ridiculous. On the original Alone in the Dark 2, saving and loading is pretty much instant on a normal computer, but on the PlayStation version, it takes forever. Like, we're talking 10 to 15 seconds to save, and then loading takes even longer. It's ridiculous. You'll find yourself staring at the loading screen for so much of your total game time. Speaking of loading screens, there is so much loading in this game, it's ridiculous. Everything is a load time. New part of an area, 5-second cut, seeing your name show up. Like, there's just load times everywhere in this PlayStation version. I think a perfect example is looking at the very first cinematic, the introduction. Look how many load times are present in this thing, and tell me that there isn't too many. It's like, just load the whole thing at once. The load times are ridiculous. They break any flow you could have gotten when going through the game. But that's assuming there was any flow to begin with, because the combat just ruins that, and it's just trial and error, hampering it even further. My last complaint with the game is that sometimes you just need to be pixel perfect for interactions. This is kind of a complaint against older games, particularly NES games, where you have to do something pixel perfect, and that's something this game has too, where you know you can interact with something, but if you're not in the absolute correct spot, like correct pixel, it just won't activate, and that can really get on my nerves. But that's not too big of an issue, honestly, just something I thought I'd bring up. It's not a gargantuan issue of the combat being a giant pile of crud, or intrusive load times, and lackluster puzzles. The entire pacing of the game is just awful, thanks to all the issues I've mentioned. The original game took me around 3 hours to beat, but beating Alone in the Dark 2 on the PlayStation 1, it took me around 5.5 hours to complete, but I can tell you that it only took that long because of all the loading, all the saving, and the amount of times I died. I'll be honest, I did not have a fun time with this game at all. The first part of the game is horrific, as they just drop you into a garden where you get swarmed by enemies with guns, they kick your ass, it's not any fun. The introduction area, actually, is the area in the game with the most enemies with guns in the entire game. Like, are you kidding me? I can imagine many people who got this game would be just very frustrated or get stuck in this area, just dying to all these enemies with guns, and just giving up on the game and not even seeing the rest of the game. And I wouldn't blame them, because the first part of the game is terrible. First impressions mean a lot, and my first impressions with Alone in the Dark 2 was, wow, this game is nothing like the original game, and this is shit. I did not have fun playing this game, and I frequently found myself ready to cuss the game out due to its BS. I did not have any fun playing this game really at any point, actually, and was really just waiting for it to end since it started.
Overall, I didn't really like the game, to be honest. It's like they abandoned all the horror elements of the original game to try to make it this like action game or something, and I'll be honest, I just can't really recommend it to anybody. I did not have any fun playing it. There was really no enjoyment here, and I just really didn't want to play it anymore, unfortunately, and I wasn't a fan, that's for sure. Not at all.
If you still like the game at this point, that's fine, but not me. I think it's one of the weaker survival horror games that I've ever played, if I want to call it that. While it does have a few positives, I think it's just completely bogged down and undermined by the negatives. Overall, I don't like it, and I'm kind of surprised that I actually don't like it, because this game seems to be fondly remembered with PC gamers, it seems. In fact, let me just say right now, though, if you're going to play the game, even after everything I just mentioned, do not play the PlayStation or Sega Saturn version. Play the original PC one. I think one reason I disliked the game so much was because I was playing an inferior version. I wish I had known that before I played through the game. Maybe the PC version just really is that much better, and I haven't really played any of the PC version other than a few minutes, and I don't really plan on playing any version of this game ever again, because I've had my patience tested with it, and I'm done. You would think the PlayStation version that came out a few years later after the original game would fix some stuff, change anything, but no, they didn't. They left the original gameplay. Like, why would you port this game and not the original Alone in the Dark? How does that make any sense? Also, there's this weird kind of spin-off bonus game known as Jack in the Dark. This was also released before Alone in the Dark 2 came out. It's maybe like 10 minutes long, and it doesn't have any combat. It's really like a kind of adventure game where you play as Grace and rescue Santa from some evil toys. And I'll just be honest, I don't have anything to comment on this. I didn't even really bother with it.
In conclusion, I just don't think it's worth playing. I think the original is a much better game, and this game just falters and is nowhere near as good. The only thing I think that's better in is its villain, and the music's pretty good. I'm not gonna lie, the music's pretty good. But not worth playing. It's really not the classic that it's kind of made out to be, at least not to me. But if you disagree, let me know why. I'd love to know. And thank you guys for watching the video. If you've made it this far, thanks. So here we are with Alone in the Dark 3, Numero Trace. And it was released a year after Alone in the Dark 2. Yeah, they really just pumped 2 games out 2 years after. But hey, it was a successful first game, a pretty disappointing, crummy second game. Maybe the third game can really pick up the pieces and redeem the series. And there's, for some reason, like, nobody talks about Alone in the Dark 3, especially not compared to 1 and 2. But let's just get right into it.
So when you start the game, you get an intro cinematic that sees Edward at his office when the power goes out. He then gets a call about a job.
No, not really, no. I'm alone in the dark. I'll explain some other time.
The job is these people are out in the desert and they were filming a movie. They have a Wild West town for said movie, and well, all of them actually go missing. And one of them happens to be Emily Hartwood, one of the playable characters in the original Alone in the Dark. With this in mind, Edward sets out to the town out in the desert. It's in the Mojave, to be exact. And once he gets there, he finds out that something has gone horribly wrong. And that's the general premise of the game. The general setup is presented in the game much better than the last game. It is more like the first Alone in the Dark, and I like that. The way the plot progresses is a bit weird though, as I'll be honest, it doesn't ever seem to go past the whole investigation phase and figuring out what's going on. What I mean by this is that there's no real antagonist in the game. After beating the game, I was like, wait, who's the bad guy? And they don't ever really say. They keep it kind of open and vague, and I just think it totally falls apart by the end. The story starts out interesting enough for you to quickly see that it kind of fails to progress in any meaningful way, and then the game just kind of ends. There's no real climax. There's no villain. There's no real antagonist. There's no one in charge of the cowboys. The game just kind of ends. Sure, there are some other side characters that show up once or twice, but they don't really mean anything in the grand scheme of things, minus Emily. Emily actually does something in the story and means a little. But there's no real big twist to the game like the previous two. In the previous 2 games, there was actually a decent twist involving something supernatural usually, but this game there just really isn't that. There's a little bit with like mutations and stuff, but nothing compared to the first 2 games. I found the plot overall to be pretty lackluster because of these faults. I was engaged at the beginning, and I think the initial premise is good, but other than that, there's really nothing. I found myself kind of yawning and getting pretty bored with the story because just barely anything happens. And by the end of the game, I was just waiting for it to end, really. The only real positive I can say about the story, besides the initial premise and the setting, is that they actually gave Edward some more character. The initial cutscene he has a decent amount of character, and throughout the game he's given a little bit of character, but that certainly is a lot more than what he's been given in the previous 2 games, so that's a plus. It's nothing amazing or anything, but it's something. They at least gave us some breadcrumbs of a character, and that's nice because this game sure doesn't introduce any meaningful characters at all, not like the previous game. The story just feels incredibly one-dimensional, underdeveloped, and overall lacking. It almost feels unfinished, in all honesty. It fails to hold my interest as, like I said, it doesn't really have a big plot twist, which is something that is a staple of horror games, and the story just kind of falls apart. As a whole, I wasn't a fan of this story despite the promising introduction, but let's get on to the gameplay. The gameplay is basically identical to Alone in the Dark 2. The run button is gone, but that was something that was only on the PlayStation version of the second game. You still play as Edward Carnby for a majority of the game, and also this lion wolf thing at one point. Edward is exactly the same as the previous 2 games, with nothing new added at all. You still go through the menus and you still select what action to perform. The actions being interact, fight, push, and for a specific area, jump again. Edward has the same attacks as before and can use a variety of weapons including a shotgun, Winchester, Tommy gun, etc. The location of the game, though, is definitely the biggest difference from the prior two games. It is now a ghost town out in the desert. It's no longer a giant mansion to explore, rather it's this entire town. It's a nice change of pace, and it's a bit refreshing after two giant houses. So you'll go through saloons, jails, and yes, caves again. I actually like the setting of the game. I think a Wild West horror game is quite original and actually really unique. I don't think it's ever been done again, minus Undead Nightmare, but that wasn't a horror game as opposed to being horror themed. This game is a bit more of a horror game, more so than the second game. The enemies are not mobsters with guns. No, most of the enemies in this game are zombie cowboys, and most of them don't actually have guns. A lot of them do, but a majority of them in the game do not. Luckily, the amount of enemies present in the game has been massively toned down from the last game. There is still a decent amount of combat, but it's nothing like the last game. For instance, the beginning area only has you fight actually like 1 or 2 zombie cowboys, not, I don't know, like 12 mobsters. The enemy count is more than reasonable. It's still too many for my liking, but it's not insane. Also near the end you do fight some radiated monsters, but they're really fought the same way as any other enemy in the game. The game has a lot more emphasis on puzzles actually, and there's certainly more puzzles in this game than the last game. All of them are pretty standard for this kind of game. It's usually finding an item, using it with another item or something in the environment, or it's interacting with something in the environment in a certain way. This game doesn't really do anything out of the ordinary when it comes to the puzzles. And you do turn into a lion wolf thing at one point, but that just means you can't interact with certain items and objects really. There just really isn't much of a difference besides the appearance. But that is it. The general gameplay for Alone in the Dark 3, I just don't really have much to say because it doesn't change anything from the first two games minus the setting. There's no new gameplay additions, substantial improvements, even quality of life improvements, nothing. Edward is literally exactly the same, and it could just feel like the game could be an expansion for Alone in the Dark 2 in all honesty. That's how much has changed, or really lack of change. And as obvious as it is now, the graphics represent that sentiment as well. The graphics are exactly the same as Alone in the Dark 2. I honestly don't see any difference in the game's graphics between Alone in the Dark 2's and this. And this game came out in 1994, right when polygons are starting to get more used in video games. We were about to get the PlayStation next year and the N64 shortly after. The graphics look fine for the time when they came out. They weren't revolutionary, they weren't a spectacle, but they were the same as the original Alone in the Darks. And when the original came out, they were a bit of a spectacle, but here, it just looks fine, really. The models are all still incredibly polygonal, animate pretty poorly, and sometimes it is hard to distinguish what some stuff is. The pre-rendered backgrounds definitely look like they're at a slightly higher resolution than the other games, but it just might be the environments themselves. And they're again the best part of the graphics and have aged the best. Surprisingly, I actually got some frame drops during a few parts in this game. I don't remember getting that in the previous two games, like where the game would actually slow down for a few seconds. Yeah, I don't think my computer can run Alone in the Dark 3, so I think that's my fault. But yeah, the game slowed down a few times, which was not cool. When it comes to the graphics, I really just have nothing to say. I've said everything that I feel about the graphics in my previous two reviews. They're again unchanged and give off that expansion feeling rather than a sequel feeling. Luckily, the sound design kind of helps it a bit. Alone in the Dark has always had really good sound design, and this game is no exception. The sound effects, while most of them are reused, they're still quite good. A lot of them have meaningful impact. Some of the monsters have actually some terrifying noises and not stupid "hey you" from the last game's enemies. That's gone. And it was a nice improvement. Something else that was an improvement in the sound department is actually the voice acting. While it is a bit cheesy in many aspects, I think it was actually much better than the last game's voice acting. Not only is the dialogue better and just better written, but the mics are smoothed out, which is a huge plus. Some of the voice actors also really play up their part, that's for sure.
He who places the war stick of thunder, son, at the center of the stone of the dead will rend the sky and hold off forever those who guard the sticks.
Well, damn, this guy just seems like an asshole in all honesty.
As a whole, the voice acting was much better than anything the series has really seen. This leads us to the music, which was great again. I think the music is all really well done. It takes the root of the second game and has music constantly playing as opposed to when the enemy just shows up. Different music does play when enemies show up though. I think the music is all really good. Not only does it kind of set the mood perfectly, but it's actually decently catchy as well. Some of the themes actually can be kind of scary and really set a tense atmosphere. If I had to describe the music in one word, it would definitely be tense, because that's the feeling I get from it. I think a lot of it is quite unsettling, and some of it is kind of catchy, I'm not gonna lie, but a lot of it is some spooky shit. Like the music when the Native Americans show up. The sound design as a whole is just really well done again, and it just goes to show that the original trilogy of Alone in the Dark games really knew what they were doing in that department, for the most part.
Oh, we're already at that point in the review. Well, yeah, there are some things that I'm just not a fan of in Alone in the Dark 3, and it's time to talk about the negatives.
First off, the game doesn't actually feel like a sequel at all. It plays and feels identical to the two previous games. And honestly, any complaints I had in the two games carry over here as well, and it's even less forgivable because this is the third game now. Running still feels a bit awkward. It's definitely smoother than the original games, but it still feels awkward. The combat is exactly the same as the previous two games, and I'll be honest, it's still terrible. There has been no attempt to fix the combat at all. It is just as bad as it was in the previous two games. While the combat is significantly toned down from the previous game, there still is a lot of combat that is present in this game. Way more than the original Alone in the Dark, that's for sure. And I'll be honest, it's just as bad as it was in the previous game. Like I said, it's still incredibly awkward. Lining up your shot with a gun is extremely difficult. The controls are beyond delayed. Fighting with your fists or an object to take out an enemy takes an eternity sometimes. Shooting is slow. Some of the enemies are just bullet sponges and can take multiple rounds. It's more effective still to just run up to them and start punching them than actually trying to get into a firefight with them. The combat still sucks. Everything that sucked about it before sucks here. It sucked then, and it sucks forever. Luckily, you fight less enemies with guns, so it's not as aggravating as it was before. The game does bring back an old issue from the original Alone in the Dark that the sequel actually did not have, and that is platforming. You do some platforming in this game, and it's as horrible, it's as terrible as it looks. It's as awkward as it looks, it's extremely precise, and it is so easy to slip off and die. You need to be saving after like every jump, because it's just not very good, and you just want to be saving a lot actually in this game. The platforming is just terrible, and I would actually say it's worse than the original game's platforming because there's more of it. My next two issues really revolve around the same thing, and that's the puzzles. Maybe I should have brought this point up when I was talking about the graphics, but some of the environments are just way too bleak for their own good. Maybe it's playing this on a giant resolution and having them stretched to make them bleak and blurry, but I could just not tell what some stuff was in this game, and I had no idea of knowing that what some stuff even was, to be honest. It was just very hard to tell what was stuff on some of these environments, what you could interact with, what you couldn't interact with. And while this could be a problem with all three games, I really saw it with this game. I didn't really see it with the first game at all, and I really didn't see it with this second game either. The first game a few times, second game not really, but this game, yes, I noticed it multiple times. And there was a couple times where I just had no idea what to do in the game, and I just had to look it up. And multiple times it was just like, really? I had no idea I could interact with that. There was no indication, and I just looked like the background. And it's happened vice versa, where I thought I could interact with something and it was the background. And it's happened multiple times. But I guess I could blame my color blindness, or just modern resolution, or just being able to not see properly. I'll take the blame for that one, I guess, that I just couldn't distinguish what stuff was in the background and what wasn't the background. But that one, it was my fault. This one, I don't think it's my fault, and that's that a lot of the puzzles in this game actually suck. I thought the original game had pretty great puzzles, and I thought the second game, while it didn't have very many puzzles, they weren't horrible. This game has about as many puzzles as the original game, but I'll be honest, a lot of them are just terrible. A lot of them are confusing, poorly laid out, vague, and outright illogical. They have to be done in that linear sequence like the second game, which is already kind of annoying since the first game didn't do that. But all of the puzzles have one way of solving them, and that's it. There's no other way. A good instance is this sheriff. You need to kill him to get an item from him. So I shot at him with a Winchester, and we're talking like a dozen times, and nothing happened. So I'm like, okay, let me try physically attacking him, and nothing happens. So I just look it up because I don't know what to do. So what you have to do is you have to lasso him first to get an item from him. Then you have to kill him with the shotgun, and only the shotgun he will die from dropping another item. Why can't I just kill him and get both items? Why do I have to whip him, then kill him with the shotgun and only the shotgun? I can't use another weapon to kill him. No, it has to be the shotgun. What I'm saying is the puzzles have to be done a very certain way, and if it's even slightly different, it won't work. You'll just stand there confused for minutes at a time. Like, why? A lot of the puzzles in this game aren't terrible, I'm gonna say that. A decent amount of them can be figured out for sure, but some of them are just way too vague and are the kind of puzzles where you're literally just walking around using every object on everything and interacting with everything, hoping something works. Sure, you can do it without a walkthrough, but you're going to be here for a while and it's just too ridiculous. Some of them in this game are way too cryptic for no reason. Here is a perfect example. Near the middle of the game, you're locked in this rather large building. In it, there are a bunch of doors, and a lot of them look the same, I'm not going to lie. Well, after exploring around enough, you come to the conclusion that you need to find a way out of this building. And to do that, you have to go through one of the doors. Now, up until this point, in the whole series, how do you get through a door? Simple. You use a key. You use a key to open said door. It's a very simple concept. Here, though, it is not that. No, it is not that at all. I had to look this up because I was just totally lost and immediately went, how was anybody supposed to guess that when I figured it out after looking it up? No, what you have to do is you have to walk up to this door that looks like any other door in the that's in the game. It looks no different from any other door. You have to shove a bullet in the door handle. Yes, shove a specific bullet you get near the beginning of the game, because yes, you can still carry unlimited objects. There's no item or weight limit. Anyway, you shove the bullet in the door, then you get out the hammer and interact with the door. By doing this, you hit the bullet, causing it to explode, causing the door to become unlocked, and then you can leave. There's no indication to do this at all, and I honestly just don't know how someone would figure this out without aimlessly wandering around for a while. It's puzzles like this that just make me not like the game as much. In addition, a lot of the time when you're interacting with an object or just the environment as a whole, you need to be pixel perfect. If you're even a pixel off from the right spot, like, it's just nothing's gonna happen. And this happened to me way more times than it should have. This kind of issue is kind of across all three games, but I definitely saw it here more than even the second game. My last issue is that I actually came across a game-breaking bug and literally lost all my progress because I had saved with the bug. It's probably my fault for only having one save file, but still. But overall, Alone in the Dark 3 does have some serious issues with it that I have just mentioned. The game would not actually be critically praised like the first and second game, and received mostly average to slightly under average reviews when it came out. And for the most part, I agree with those reviews. This game is at its very best average, but for the most part, it's pretty under average. So would I say it's worse than the second game? No, I wouldn't say it's worse. I would honestly say they are both at the same level in terms of quality, and that is slightly under average. While there is less combat, and I wasn't really frustrated with it like the second game, I was more frustrated with its puzzles and rather lacking story.
Here we are at the end of the original trilogy, and I'll be honest, I can't really recommend the original trilogy, honestly, because you see, I think the first game is a classic and is a great game, but the second game I thought sucked, and this third game, I think it's really the same. I think it sucks too. I wouldn't recommend it to horror fans. That the game doesn't really try to be that much of a horror game, to be honest. It kind of still actiony, less than the second game, but it still is. But I think it's got its own other issues. And in all honesty, I just didn't really have fun playing the game. I wanted this one and the second one. I was just kind of waiting for the games to end, which is never a good thing. And I just really didn't like this third game either. But next time, we'll be looking at the fourth Alone in the Dark game. This one wouldn't come out for many years, and it's known as the New Nightmare. We'll be looking at the Dreamcast version. So, I'll see you guys there, hopefully. So, here we are with Alone in the Dark 4. Alone in the Dark 4 New Nightmare, released around 2000, 2001-ish. Now, that's a pretty big gap between Alone in the Dark 3 and this. It's a good 7-ish years. And, well, hopefully this game stacks up better than Alone in the Dark 2 and 3 and can capture the magic that was the original Alone in the Dark. Let's just get right into it.
So I'll be looking at the Dreamcast version, like I mentioned, and the game is actually 2 discs, as you can see here. The Dreamcast version even has this nice little VMU logo and even has this nice little saving text that shows up. I always love how the Dreamcast actually does that. The intro is actually pretty decent to the game. It is a bit cheesy and makes it look like there's a ton of action in this game, but I liked it nonetheless. It really hyped me up, that's for sure. I really actually like the title screen in this game also. Really spooky, and the words are, well, Alone in the Dark. So when you start the game, you have this introduction cinematic. This obviously sets up the game. The year is 2001 and it's actually Halloween. Well, Edward Carnby, a private detective, finds out that his best friend and partner Charles Fiskes has been found dead off the coast of Shadow Island, a really mysterious island off the coast of Massachusetts. Well, Edward wants to go figure out what the hell is going on with this island. And then there's some nonsense with these tablets also. And additionally, a young university professor named Aline actually joins Edward to help with these tablets also. However, on the plane ride there, Edward makes it clear he actually has no interest in these stupid tablets and just wants to find who killed Fisk. Aline also reveals that the professor that lives on this island named Obed Morton actually might be her father, because she has no idea who he is, and it might be this guy apparently. Well, as they're flying over Shadow Island, the plane gets attacked by an unknown creature. They both jump out of the plane and parachute to the ground, but are separated. Edward lands in the woods, and Aline actually lands on this giant mansion. And it's up to the two to explore what the hell is actually going on. I actually like the setup. While there is a bit much with the idea of killer and tablets and this guy who's apparently Aline's father, and yeah, that is a bit cliche, I still think it is a good setup. I would definitely say it's much better than the second and third game setup. The way they landed the mansion was very well done, I thought. The initial setup is one of the stronger aspects of the story as a whole, I actually thought. I would say that the plot in this game is actually decently well done. Sure, it's not amazing, it doesn't have the best writing or the best plot twists or even that great of an ending, but I still thought it was good for what it was. It definitely doesn't have the same impact as the original games, but this is definitely the closest so far in the series to matching it. In the previous 3 videos, I did actually spoil the game's plot and ending, but I'm actually not going to do that here since the game is not only a little newer, as it was actually released in the 2000s, but I actually think that that's part of the experience is figuring out the story, and I don't want to ruin it for this one. I will say though, in a spoiler-free way, that the last portion of the game I just really was not a fan of. The game goes from this kind of mystery setup similar to the original game to this kind of just crazy supernatural plot, and I wasn't really big on this. I mean, I should have probably seen it coming with the tablets, but I just really wasn't a fan. I feel like the story just kind of drags in the end, and a lot of the questions that get answered at the questions that you get asked at the beginning of the game don't have the best answers. The payout for these questions I really just was not a fan of, and a lot of them I just felt kind of discontent with. The ending was also not very good. It was pretty basic and very predictable. I think most of the story is well done, but I think the very end really just wasn't that great. Overall, the story is fine, and I think it starts well and just kind of dips in quality by the end. But I can say without a doubt in my mind that these are the most fleshed out characters in any Alone in the Dark game. Edward and Aline get so much personality, like way more than any of the other games combined. They just actually have character. Edward is a bit of a smartass and tries to be confident in what he's doing, while also being a little flirty, and Aline is scared at first, but quickly becomes a strong female lead and is actually pretty smart. Much better characters than the previous 3 games. And this game also is not canon with the other Alone in the Dark games. It's just its own separate game. They don't try to connect it to the other ones. And I actually like the modern setting also. In fact, I just think the whole world is actually one of the better parts of the entire game, or at least one of the better developed parts. I think the setting is, well, not the most original. I think it still is alright. At least the cliche setting is done well. I mean, you also gotta remember that Alone in the Dark helped create that cliche in video games, so there's that also. But I actually did like the setting and the world in general, and while the supernatural stuff I could kinda do without, I still think it was well executed for the most part. It could have been so much worse, that's for sure. The previous 2 games really showed that. But enough about the story. So once you start the game, you're able to choose between Edward and Aline. Now, both of them actually have basically completely separate campaigns, like Resident Evil 2. In fact, this kind of ripped off Resident Evil 2 greatly. They both fight mostly the same enemies and get mostly the same weapons, but have totally different puzzles and go around the environments in a different way. They meet up a few times in the story, but that's really only a few times. And there's not too much difference when it comes to actually playing as them. Edward is more focused on combat, while Aline is more focused on puzzles. The gameplay is very standard late 90s, early 2000s survival horror, more so than even the original 3 games. The first thing you'll notice is that this game is very dark. A lot of the game is actually just borderline pitch black. You really are alone in the dark. I mean, it's even in the name. However, both characters have a flashlight. The flashlight does not take batteries or anything. You can infinitely use it, and you can even use a weapon with it. But you will be searching all over with this flashlight because it is really dark. And that's just one thing both of your characters have now. Edward and Aline have the same gameplay and are basically interchangeable when it comes to what they can do. They have tank controls and have generally slow combat. It's obviously nowhere near as slow as the previous games, but it is kind of slow. You can actually move and shoot, which is a nice touch. There is a run button as well, which again, nice. Like any good survival horror game, you don't regenerate health and you have to use a medkit. I will say this game straight up steals from Resident Evil, and you don't have hit points, rather it has a status. Items are quite important in this game, as it is a standard survival horror game where items usually are a core part to the game. You will be collecting items and using them on something frequently. The game does not have an item management system. You can just carry everything again. You come across a number of items in this game. Many of them are key items and are used on the environment in some way. However, you also get weapons like I previously mentioned. Weapons include revolver, triple barrel shotgun, a rocket launcher, grenade launcher, and even some crazier weapons as well. Using these feels much better than any of the previous games right off the bat. You'll obviously come across ammo for said weapons as well. In addition to this, there are many documents that you will find throughout the game with notes and general lore to the game or used for the puzzles. These are also stored in your inventory. I guess the last thing to mention for inventory is to save you actually have to find a save item known as the Charm of Saving. That's pretty silly, but alright. But these are pretty common in the game. But what will you be doing in the new Alone in the Dark, The New Nightmare? Well, what you'll be doing is exploring this mansion or the island itself, killing monsters, finding items, using these items on the environment, and generally just solving puzzles. I brought up earlier the flashlight, and it's important on the lighting up the environment. This is actually even more vital than it seems, as many objects in the game are just totally hidden on the pre-rendered background, and you'll actually have to shine your flashlight on them to be able to even see them to pick them up. So a lot of the time you'll be exploring these areas looking for stuff to pick up using the flashlight. However, when you're actually exploring or solving puzzles, when you're not doing either of those, you're in combat. The combat is not only much better than the original couple games, but the enemies are actually one of the better parts of the game. A lot of the enemies are quite unique, minus the zombies. These are generic. A lot of them are actually reptilian, strangely shaped creatures. Some of them react to the light and can even be stunned or pushed back from it, and none of them have projectiles. That's just how it should be. Later on in the game, you do fight some big, beefy monsters, and I think fighting these are fine as well. In fact, the combat is just swell. When it comes to the puzzles, a lot of them are kind of your standard fare for a survival horror game. When it's not finding an item and using that item on something, it's usually activating something to activate something else to give you an item or key to another door. In fact, a lot of the puzzles revolve around keys and just getting to the next area. Like I mentioned, both characters get totally different puzzles, so it's more than worth it to play through both, especially if you like one or the other. I think the next question to ask is the game scary? I'll be honest, I think this game actually has some moments where yes, it is scary. And I'm not talking jump scares either, I'm not talking about that crap. I'm talking like the tense atmosphere that kind of gets you in the slow burn, the tense moment. Despite the game's age, I think it is still a bit scary at least. I'll be honest, it's way more than the previous 3 games. It's probably the scariest Alone in the Dark game ever made. But a lot of the game is tense, I'm not gonna lie, and parts where you see an enemy for the first time and really have no idea what to do can actually be kind of scary. But when it comes to gameplay, that's really the gameplay in a nutshell. While Resident Evil was heavily inspired by Alone in the Dark, this game takes many, and I mean many, cues from Resident Evil as well. But I mean, it's like at this point, who's copying who in this situation? It's really just like a copy situation on both ends. Now, when it comes to the graphics, I think they're actually pretty good. Like I've said a couple times, I'm playing the Dreamcast version, which came out in 2001, and I thought these looked fine. They look pretty alright. The character models were actually pretty decent in this game. They actually have an alright amount of detail. They aren't amazing or anything, and I still think that they could use some improvement, but they were pretty good for the time. At least the faces look good, but there is no facial expressions, and their lips don't move when they talk. The animation is a bit stiff, and Elaine's running animation is just awful, but besides that, I think the animation is alright. It's not amazing or mind-blowing, but it is more than serviceable. I think the monsters have really good design in this game, and they all animate really in this kind of creepy manner. The frame rate was rock solid on this version as well, which was nice. I never saw any issues with the frame rate, which really kept the immersion level up and was really nice. Now, the part of the graphics that I think stands out is the lighting and the backgrounds. Now, the game uses pre-rendered backgrounds, however, the developers actually created a completely unusual graphics engine which allowed the 3D player character's flashlight to properly illuminate and cast shadows on the 2D pre-rendered backgrounds. So what I'm saying is that it will actually be really dark in most areas, and when you shine your flashlight on it, it will actually light up. That is something never seen in horror games with pre-rendered backgrounds, as usually it's just one consistent lighting for the area. However, here you really are using your flashlight all over and lighting up all these dark areas. It's really unique actually, and it's easily the most unique aspect of the entire game. With this in mind, the lighting is just fantastic in this game, especially for when it came out. Like, it can just look downright artistic in many aspects, and the way the light was handled is just great. The shadows are also really well done and they make the graphics look even better than they actually are. The pre-rendered backgrounds don't look bad either, and this entire dynamic light system with them is just awesome. One of the reasons the game is tense / creepy / scary is because of this lighting, how good it is and just how dark it is with the various levels of illumination. It's just really well done here. So while the graphics obviously were not absolutely mind-blowing, I still think they were pretty good as a whole with awesome lighting and backgrounds that just stand out. The sound honestly is really well also. This game continues the trend of just having really well sound design in the Alone in the Dark series. The sound effects in the game are actually really good. Everything sounds just really well done, like the guns sounds great, running around sounds great, all the monsters make creepy noises, some of the forest noises are just excellent. The sound effects are just superb, honestly. The music goes back to that Alone in the Dark 1 feel. Rather than being catchy or upbeat, this game really instills a sense of dread and unease. A lot of the game there is no music, and you just hear the sound of your footsteps. When enemies show up, usually some music plays, and it's not like it's amazing or anything, but I think that it sacrifices being amazing to really set the mood and add to that tense atmosphere, which I think the game does in spades. The music is really well done in that aspect, and while I'm not going to have it in this video or playing in the background because I just don't think it fits a video very well, I will tell you it contributed to the game feeling creepy. The only part of the game in terms of sound that I thought was pretty shoddy was the voice acting. The voice acting is, well, it's that typical 90s cheesy voice acting. It's like it's from a B movie, and while I think the delivery is decent enough and is better than something you would see in probably Resident Evil, it isn't amazing. There are some really cheesy lines in this game, and some of the delivery is just borderline funny.
I'm telling you, everything will be okay.
I don't want to die.
Hey, let go of me.
Don't leave me here. Please, I beg you.
I said let go of me.
Go on.
Really, what I'm getting at is it's very campy, and it reminds me a lot of the shark movies I've watched because it's just kind of amateurishly written, if that makes any sense. It did invoke a few smiles for me though, so I guess it's good. But don't expect anything great with the voice acting in this game. It was fine, but it was the only weak point in the sound, I thought, and I can say that confidently. But as a whole, sound was pretty good too. But it's time for our favorite part of the review, what wasn't so good with Alone in the Dark: The New Nightmare. Well, I do have a few issues. I already mentioned being not the biggest fan of the story, and particularly the end, but in terms of actual gameplay, I do have some issues as well. First off, some of these puzzles I just am not a fan of at all. When it comes to non-linearity of the puzzles in this game, I will say this game is still pretty linear. It's not as linear as the last two games where every single puzzle had to be solved in a certain order in a certain way to continue, but it's not as much as the original games. Still, it was a step in the right direction, and while these puzzles are nowhere near as bad as some of the puzzles in the previous games, a few of them really stuck in my craw the wrong way, if that makes any sense. For instance, there is this stone puzzle you have to do in the second half of the game as Edward, and I'm just not on board with this puzzle. It takes way too long, and you're just waiting for Aline to confirm if you're standing in front of the right stone to do the ritual, and I found it kind of boring. My biggest issue with the puzzles really isn't just one issue, it's a couple puzzles. It's like a couple puzzles, actually, that have this issue for both Elaine and Edward. It's the amount of reading you have to do. Now, don't get me wrong, I like to read as much as the next person. I already have to do enough of it for college, but there is just too much reading in this game. For instance, there is a puzzle where you have to read, I'm not kidding, 52 pages of a book to figure out the puzzle for some numbers. Are you kidding me? That is just way too much reading for one puzzle. That's just one puzzle that involves reading. There are multiple puzzles in this game that involve just reading a ton of pages in a diary or book or some trivial similar thing. And it's not just limited to either Edward or Elaine, it's both. And while I don't think it's a huge issue, I can say a few of these puzzles are really annoying because of this. Obviously, the ratio of good versus bad puzzles is more skewed in the good section, but I just thought it was worth bringing up because some of the puzzles that involve reading that are even more than a couple pages in a book were just not my cup of tea at all in that boring ritual puzzle. My next issue is actually an issue that's been present in every Alone in the Dark game, and that's that it's too overly context sensitive. And what I mean is if you want to pick up an item or interact with the environment in a certain way, you have to be in a very specific spot to pick that item up. If you're even 1 pixel off, you just won't pick it up. I found this issue most prevalent when trying to pick up an item off the ground, especially near the end of the game, and you just won't pick it up. And I'm like, pick this shit up, dude. And it was kind of frustrating. Not a new issue, but still kind of annoying. Speaking of the end of the game, though, as I brought up earlier, I'm not a fan of that either. I already said again for the third time now, not a fan of the end of the story. Wasn't huge on the supernatural stuff. It was decently implemented, but still wasn't that big on it. But the gameplay also goes down the same route, as I'm not a fan of the gameplay at the end of the game. The game at the very end kind of abandons its horror roots and goes full like action with kind of like the second and third game, and obviously it's not as shit as those. First off, the shooting is actually competent, unlike those games. The enemies never get projectiles either, so that's a huge plus. But at the end of the game, you're just running around annihilating everything. At first I thought this was kind of cool, but this just goes on way too long. Like, it just kind of drags, and I thought the pacing was very weak in this aspect, and the final boss is nothing to write home about. But honestly, this entire issue I just brought up could be chalked up as a pacing issue. I mean, Elaine even has the same issue, so it's not like it's just exclusive to Carnby. Something that isn't really an issue, but it's just kind of weird, is that Elaine and Carnby really are the same. They are interchangeable. I don't know, maybe I expected something a little more unique from each one of them. Maybe I'm just spoiled from Resident Evil 2. Maybe. My last issue with the game is glitches. I just had a number of glitches in this game. The most common one was when an enemy would spawn in just really awkwardly. It just kind of phases into existence, and then the enemy would either get stuck on me or the environment, or multiple enemies would just spawn in on me and I would just get totally screwed over and killed. Another glitch is like where my character would just be frozen in place, or the game would actually crash, and it got to a point where my Elaine save file was just completely bugged and I couldn't actually finish the game as her. I got decently far, but I couldn't actually finish the game as Elaine because my save was just so bugged out and it would just crash every time I did something. The game is lacking in polish is what I'm saying. Now, some people have brought this up as an issue. I don't really see it as this, but this game doesn't really add anything new to survival horror. And I mean, it really doesn't bring anything new to the table, and it doesn't come up with this grand idea. It has a dynamic light system and an interesting graphics engine, but besides that, the game doesn't do anything to distinguish itself from basically any other survival horror game around the time. And while I don't think that every game has to be innovative or do something super original to be good, some people feel that way about this game. It can feel a bit complacent and even a bit generic, but like I said, I don't think that the game has to do something like that, be innovative or new, to stick out. And to be fair, Alone in the Dark kind of created these tropes with its horror roots, and this game really plays it to its strengths, as opposed to Alone in the Dark 2 and 3, which did not at all. But I could see how a seasoned horror veteran who has played all the Resident Evils, the Silent Hills, or Fatal Frames or whatever, and could go, this game's kind of more of the same. It is to an extent, but I'm not going to harp on the game because it's Alone in the Dark. Like I said, it created these tropes, these stereotypes, and even this gameplay, actually. So yeah, when they do follow it up a number of years later, when the genre is pretty played out at this point, yeah, it can feel a bit basic. But I still think that the game, what it sets out to do, it does well. Sure, the game has some flaws, like I mentioned, but I still enjoyed my time with the game, and I got a good couple scares out of it. What this game really is, over everything else, is just underrated. I never, and I mean never, hear anybody talk about this game unless they are a Alone in the Dark fan to begin with. Other than that, never hear anybody talk about this game. I never see it anywhere. When I look up great survival horror games or best survival horror games, I don't see this game anywhere near that. When I even look up survival horror games on Google, I don't get this. This game is really underrated, and it is just the definition of a hidden gem. It really re-established this franchise too and set it on track. The developers knew what made Alone in the Dark good to begin with and actually played up those strengths with a new game. It was great. Instead of trying to make the game a lot more action focused, they really went for a horror vibe, minus that last part of the game. And I think that a lot of people just wrote this game off as being just kind of generic, bland, or not being innovative in a time where horror games really were being innovative, like possibly ever, with games like Silent Hill 2, Resident Evil Code Veronica, and the first Fatal Frame. And yeah, this game is nowhere near as innovative or important as those games, but it's really not trying to be. It was really trying to go back to its roots of Alone in the Dark. What made Alone in the Dark great? And that's what it set out to do. It set out to make Alone in the Dark good again, and I think it really succeeded. So sure, you're not going to have your mind blown with this game, but I think you'll have a decent time with the game. It's not perfect, it's not amazing, but it's a more than competent horror game. With 2 playthroughs, the game is easily the longest in the series, with an easy 8 to 10 hours of gameplay. Now, the game was released many times. It was released on PlayStation 1, but I have heard this version is ass. There's obviously the Dreamcast version, and the game was released on PS2, which is probably your best choice to play the game. The game was also released on PC, but at least in my experience, the PC version just did not work. If you want to go through the hassle of getting it to work, then be my guest. But I recommend the PS2 and the Dreamcast version. It's really just an underrated hidden gem that might actually be worth your time.
So in conclusion, Alone in the Dark, The New Nightmare really was a return to the formula. They really actually looked at what worked in the original Alone in the Dark and really built upon it to make a good game, actually. And I'm quite surprised that. But I'm glad too. They made a good game, and that's what matters.
Fuck you anyway.
Well, it seems after Alone in the Dark, The New Nightmare, that was pretty much it from Alone in the Dark. There wouldn't be any more. What is that? I think it came from here. Yeah, there was the 2008 Alone in the Dark reboot by Atari. This was supposed to be the grand return of the series. And, well, it hadn't had a game in a while. It had 2 movies somewhere around there that we're not going to talk about. But it was supposed to be, well, a big jump for survival horror games. It was supposed to be the next big series to compete Resident Evil and Silent Hill. This game.
So here we are with Alone in the Dark 2008. Yes, the menu screen isn't exactly the best, but it looks better than the last couple games, I guess. I will say first off, the game tries to do something that didn't really catch on that much in gaming, and that was the use of episodes in the game. And it's not like where you can buy each episode individually like Siren Blood Curse or a Telltale game. No, it was that you actually just buy the whole game, and then it splits them up into episodes in the game itself, Resident Evil Revelations does this actually, and I'm not against the idea, but man, I just don't think they needed to be here, and I'll explain why much later. So every time you start the game back up, or you start a new game, it has the previously on Alone in the Dark, and then it goes on and has a little recap like a TV show. Anyway, the game starts out in first person. You're waking up from something, and you see this other guy with you, this old man, whose name is Theo. You're waking up from a exorcism or something, they say, something like that, and there are these other people who are clearly the bad guys because they have guns and military outfits. They say some cryptic shit about a ritual and a stone, and then they're taking you up to the roof to kill you, but then the guy gets attacked by some benevolent force. So then your character escapes and sees the old man basically plummet to his death with the other guy who is the antagonist of the game. After that, our hero comes across a mirror and finds out just what he looks like. He also has amnesia and doesn't remember anything of what happened prior to waking up. After continuing a bit, he meets up with this woman named Sarah, who also doesn't know what's going on. And outside, it seems like the end of the world is actually happening. All the while, the bad guys are talking about the light bringer to Earth or some crap like that, and they need the stone to do it. They want to summon the demon, it seems. But the duo just want to get the hell out of there. They eventually find Theo, the old man, that was presumed dead in the parking lot, where he leaves with them. After they eventually get out of this godforsaken building, they get to Central Park, where the old man actually just kills himself, saying to find him in the museum or some shit, and gives Edward the stone. Whoop. Did I spoil it a little? Well, you see, right after this, you do a bit more investigation, and you find out that, yeah, you are actually Edward Carnby. Yes, the same Edward Carnby from the original games. However, apparently only Alone in the Dark 1 and 2 are canon, since that's all that's referenced. But yeah, it's the same dude who is well over 100 years old. And Sarah and Edward, the pair, they just go, okay. With all this other shit going on, Edward being 100 years old doesn't really sound too crazy, I guess. After this, the pair will make their way to the museum and just try to figure out what the hell is going on. Honestly, I could go even further in the plot, but I'm going to just stop there for a second for a general plot synopsis. So the plot, if you couldn't tell, at least the beginning portion of it, purposely makes you ask about 22 different questions and gives you basically two answers. Questions like, who really is this old guy? Who is the antagonist? Why is the stone that everyone keeps bringing up so important? Why is the world actually just collapsing? Why are there killer cracks in the walls? And who are you? The only question that gets answered is who you are, that you're Edward Carnby, and that's really it. It really likes shrouding you in mystery at first. The characters in the game are not only generally poorly written, but their delivery is just so cheesy and funny, and really because of this, it just makes the situation seem almost comical to some extent. Edward doesn't remember anything, and doesn't want to mess with anyone, and just wants to get the hell out of there. Then all of a sudden he decides he's going to be the savior and save the world or whatever. It's pretty silly. And like his entire turn or arc just kind of comes out of nowhere, and he just kind of decides, okay, yeah, I'll save everyone, that sounds good. Sarah is really just thrown in there, and all of a sudden becomes an important character, but doesn't really feel like one because she just doesn't do like anything. In fact, nobody actually does like anything except Edward. Everyone just kind of meanders around, and Edward's the only one that really gets shit done. The main antagonist in the game is just horrible. He just totally disappears, reappearing for like one tiny scene in the middle of the game and then disappears again. He feels like a one-note villain. They even treat him like that, and he's really just an afterthought is what he is. And the end of the story really is about Edward and the stone, actually. Like, this villain is just he's just nothing. Everything else is pretty superfluous as a result until the very end of the game. Now, while the game loves to shroud you in mystery for like the first half of the game, when the game finally starts answering all those questions, it feels very haphazard, and they don't really answer all of them. I feel like some of the answers are pretty crummy and they just got lazy. Well, I did just give a general plot synopsis and usually don't spoil anything in my reviews. I'm actually going to go a little bit more in depth with this story and the endings in particular. So spoiler warning to an 11-year-old game, but I will say you're not actually missing like anything, trust me. But I'm going to go into the story. So the whole story is about this light bringer and stopping the end of the world, basically. In the end, it turns out you need to find this key, which is literally another human with this weird shit on him or whatever. After some benign exploration around Central Park, Edward finds him in some tomb or something. You take him back to the place in the museum where the old man said you'd find him. The main antagonist, this is the main antagonist, I might add, shows up, but it's pretty hilarious what happens.
So, here's the man who walked the path of light. Was it a pleasant walk?
You're really starting to piss me off, Crowley. You're bullshit. Magical stones, monsters, prophecies. None of that means shit when you've got a bullet in the head, does it, Crowley?
Yeah, that's it. Literally the main antagonist in the game is just a total joke. At the beginning, he actually seems to do something, then disappears, shows up for literally one cutscene, disappears again, and then that happens. Like he's just a horrible antagonist because you even forget that he's in the game. An antagonist doesn't really get much worse than that. Sarah, the female lead, her entire arc leading up to this point is that she's going to help Edward and that she loves him or something and wants to save the world also. It's because at one point Edward does save her and then they start making out. I don't know about you, but if I just learned this dude was 100 years old, the world was coming to an end, the last thing I would want to do is make out with this dude with this ugly ass scar on his face. I'd be trying to survive, the fuck? Edward and Sarah's relationship in this game is very poorly demonstrated, and it seems like they are nothing more than acquaintances who just bitch at each other at best. They do have a somewhat common goal, but they honestly seem like awkward teenagers that have just met for the first time off Tinder, which has happened to me. But no, they apparently love each other and stuff, like whatever. Anyway, I've totally gone off track at this point, so let me realign. So Edward and Sarah and the key, the person, go into the secret tomb that's in the storage room that's in the museum. Here there is this giant door. The key says that literally this is the door to Lucifer, as in the devil, as in Satan. Both keys are put in and the door opens. Edward holds the stone and begins getting possessed by Lucifer. See, whoever holds the stone becomes a vessel for the devil to use when he finally comes to Earth. However, Sarah grabs the stone and she starts getting possessed. You're then given an option to either kill Sarah and then you get possessed, or let Sarah get possessed by Lucifer. So let me go over the endings. If you let Sarah live and have her become Lucifer, it's pretty funny what happens.
Are you all right?
Do you love me
Yes,
more than your memories?
they're the past.
Would you fight me? What will you do now? Kill me?
Fuck.
How does it feel to be so alone?
I'm used to it.
If you kill Sarah and get possessed, it's even funnier what happens.
I'm the light bringer. I'm the fucking universe. Fucking universe. Fucking universe.
I will be honest, I can't tell which ending is the good or bad ending. They're both pretty bad, and Lucifer ends up coming to Earth and is just going to take over Earth. They're both really funny, but neither has a real conclusion, anything resembling a happy ending, and it just really lacks anything meaningful. All it really does is just sparked up a bunch of memes. That's all that's really happened with these endings. Like, I'm the fucking universe? How do you even write something like that and think it's serious? Besides the ending being just completely inconclusive and not even an ending, I think it's time to bring up the major plot holes that is in this game. Anyone who actually likes the story in this game, I really have to ask you why. Did you just totally turn your brain off while the game was going on? Like, did you even do a second of critical thought? The initial premise that I went over seems decent enough. We have amnesia, there's like this cultist group after you, the world is ending, the devil's trying to come back to Earth. It's decent enough. But then after that initial, I don't know, like 2, maybe 3 hours, the story completely, and I mean completely falls apart. let's go back to the ending situation again. I really have to ask though, why did they do this? Like Edward and Sarah. See, the main antagonist is like a cultist who is trying to unleash the stone's evil power and become a vessel for Lucifer. Or at least at the beginning, they want that old man, Theo, to get possessed by Lucifer. So someone is getting possessed by Lucifer here. And obviously Edward wants to stop him and protect the stone. He does so like twice in the game. So why does he completely contradict that and end up summoning Lucifer anyway? You would think he would want to destroy the stone and then kill the other key, who is literally a person, so then the devil can never come to Earth. But no, instead he does what the antagonist, the cultist, was trying to do and summons Lucifer and gets possessed. Like, am I just totally missing something here? Like, I legitimately even looked it up and read it on Wikipedia, and it says right there that he ends up just summoning Lucifer, and there's like no reason as to why he shouldn't have just eviscerated the stone immediately. Why didn't he just go with the cultist then if that's what he was trying to do? I actually just don't understand it. Edward should not have gone anywhere near the museum because that's where Lucifer would get summoned and possess someone. So really, even the initial plot synopsis doesn't even make any sense. Why would they even want to go to the museum when Lucifer can literally come to Earth from the museum? Like, they would want to get as far away from the museum as actually possible. How does Sarah not realize this in all the notes that she starts looking at, that you're literally summoning the devil to Earth? They never explain why this is a good idea and why they would want to do this. Like, they actually say it's a bad idea earlier in the game and they don't want this, but then they do it anyway. Another question is, why is the world ending? Why is the Earth just collapsing? Why are there monsters everywhere? Why is it like the apocalypse? This is never explained, and they have no reason as to how to stop this either. It doesn't even get stopped in the game. It literally just ends with those stupid endings. Where is the government? Where is anyone other than Edward and Sarah and the cultist group? It makes no sense how Edward is alive in this game. They never even explain it either. He's just there, okay? He's just like 100 years old, and they don't explain that weird scar on his face. He didn't have that in the old games. I don't even know what's going on. They don't explain how the key is alive either. The person who's been alive for centuries, according to him, and just like waiting, like, oh, okay, wait, what? I guess the stone, him being the stone or whatever, just made him immortal. Nothing is explained. There is almost no context given to the player. There's a little bit of backstory that you get in emails, but you really expect me to read this? Why can't they just tell me in the game? The old man Theo kills himself so he can just show up in the room when Edward closes his eyes. Wait, like, what? Edward, I guess, is like the chosen one or some shit? I'm just lost in so many aspects, and looking it up doesn't even answer anything. The game just flat out doesn't tell you. It doesn't have a good conclusive story, and it just has so many like plot threads that just end up hanging. They don't get tied up. That nothing. There's nothing.
There's plenty of plot holes. In fact, here's a plot hole. Who is this guy on the cover of the game? Is this supposed to be Edward? This doesn't look like Edward. Edward has a big ass scar on his face. Who is this guy? It's a plot hole.
I'm sure I could find even more plot holes that I haven't even found yet, but I've only gone over some of the ones that I've done a little bit of thinking about, and I already found a bunch of issues, and so you know what, I'm just gonna stop there. I could be there all day. This story sucks. The characters also suck. They have varying degrees of sucking, to be fair, but they just all suck. The world in this game, it sucks. The game initially can draw some intrigue and interest, however it completely fails to capitalize on any of this at all, and just ends up being a complete mess of a story, and really a waste of time. No, when it comes to a story in a video game, this is one of the worst I've ever seen, where they just don't give a shit and just have a ton of loose ends. It's a real slap in the face to the original Alone in the Dark games and its fans. But I'm done with the bitching of the story. It's already almost at the 15-minute mark. It's time to talk about the gameplay. Alone in the Dark is a survival horror, third-person, first-person, somewhat open world, but also linear game with lots of platforming. Did you catch all that? Me neither. Let's just dissect this game one aspect at a time. When you start the game, it's in first person. You actually have to blink because your vision is just going to crap. I don't know how that makes any sense, but I would never want to drive like this. This blinking mechanic in the game, though, is awful. You have to push down on the right analog stick to blink. You have to do it very frequently, and it gets very annoying quickly. However, it's only in the first part of the game where you need to blink. This is like the first 5 to 10 minutes of the game also. Okay, so after that, you're introduced to the real mechanics of the game. So the game sometimes has fixed camera angles. Sometimes, depending on the area you're in. Then sometimes it just has a normal third-person perspective. However, at any point, regardless of what angle you're at, if you press Y on an Xbox 360 controller, you go into first person. The game has a few gameplay aspects to it. The game is combat, it is puzzles, survival elements, world interactivity, it even has platforming in it, and then there's even open world aspects to it. Let's just take it one step at a time. Let's start with the combat. There are a few methods of attacking, really. Early on in the game, Edward actually gets a gun. You basically always have ammo for this gun throughout the entire game. To shoot the gun, you have to actually go into first person, and then you literally just aim and shoot. It's pretty simple. You only ever have this pistol. It's pretty weak, it's pretty slow, and it takes a while to reload. It's not the best, and is really used for the other types of weapons, and it's not a very good weapon to use in combat. In the world, there are many objects Edward can pick up and attack with. Chairs, baseball bats, tables, anything that's really lying around that he can pick up. You can pick it up and you can swing it. To swing, you use the right analog stick, literally flicking the stick in the direction you want to swing your weapon. So yes, a lot of flicking the stick as you try to attack enemies with it, knocking them over and such. The enemies in the game come in 4 variants. These little bug shits, these die in one hit from literally everything. These cracks. Yeah, they're literally just cracks in the wall or the ground, and you blow these up. The humans, that's humans with a Z, and everything these guys try to do really is just a melee attack, or they'll actually shoot their long-ass tongues at you, and usually you just knock them over with your melee weapons. The last enemy type is these tall, big as shit creatures that throw like shurikens at you, I guess, and do melee attacks. Really, it's just a stronger version of the humans with a Z. Now, the humans with a Z cannot be truly killed unless you burn them. You can beat the shit out of them all you want, but they won't really be dead. They will come back eventually. The only way to truly kill them is by burning them. This is the introduction to fire. Fire is very essential in this game, and it is in a lot of the game. And I will give credit where credit is due. It actually has some really good fire physics and mechanics, and it's some of the best I've ever seen in a video game. There is usually fire somewhere around enemies, and you can even light a melee weapon on fire, then attack an enemy with it. And if you don't have a melee weapon to light on fire and you fight enemies, you can just drag the body and then toss it onto the fire to permanently kill the enemy. There is a lot of fire in this game, and sometimes there's just too much of it, actually. And so there's lots of fire extinguishers in the world, and you'll have to put the fires out quite a bit. This actually happens a fair amount. You'll be putting fires out, so I really hope you like doing that. But can you make your own fire? That is the question. Well, unlike the game's plot, I will answer these questions. Yes, you can. Here is where the survival part comes in. You see, you have a limited, and I mean very limited, inventory space. Edward looks down in his coat to see what he can carry. You will always have a gun, flashlight, a lighter, and some ammunition, but the rest of the inventory is up to you. There are many different things you can pick up in the world, such as bandages, healing spray, plastic bottles that explode, Molotovs, batteries for the flashlight, bug spray, and even anti-rust spray. If you come across, you will come across a lot of these bottles, actually. See, Edward can hold 2 things at a time in each hand. The right hand is used for the gun, lighter, or key item. The left hand is the flashlight, spray, or explosive bottle. If you have the explosive bottle out in the left hand and the gun in the right, and you throw, the game will go all slow-mo, and then you can blow up the explosive bottle by shooting it. If you have the, say, anti-rust spray out and the lighter, you have a mini flamethrower. Or you can put a cloth with an explosive bottle to make it a Molotov somehow. Then, if you have that out, and you have the lighter out, you can light the Molotov and throw it. There's even tape that allows your bottles to stick to surfaces. Now, in Alone in the Dark, you are going to get hurt. It's that simple. You do regenerate a small amount of health, but for the most part, you don't. See, you have to find these healing sprays that are all over the world. Once Edward is hurt, you literally see a flesh wound or a cut, or there's just this big, ugly, fleshy thing on his jacket. You then have to get out the medic spray and spray every individual wound to heal up. You have to do this every time. But all of this item management, combining, crafting, mechanic thing, it's all essential to the game. They don't act like it really is sometimes, but it really is to the game. It's the best way to fight enemies, and a lot of the puzzles require these tools, especially the throwing the explosive bottle and blowing it up. See, the game uses a lot of physics, or at least a lot of light-based puzzles as well. Puzzles are actually pretty common in this game, most of them being physics related, stuff like getting an electrical wire out of the water so you can walk through it, blowing a door up, or lighting something on fire. There is a decent amount of puzzles in this game, like more than a couple, like more than like 3. There's even some light-based ones where this black gooey shit will actually just totally instantly kill you if you aren't in light, so you need to get creative because your flashlight can only do so much, like finding glow sticks or burning a chair and throwing it in that room. I actually like these puzzles, and I think that anything that uses the light or fire in this game is actually pretty well done. So the next part of the game is the platforming. So I guess this game saw Uncharted and decided to copy it. There is actually a decent amount of platforming in this game as well. This is where you have mostly fixed camera angles and you just have to do very basic platforming. Climbing, ledge grabbing, it's basic stuff here. The last part of the gameplay that's worth mentioning is the driving in open world. After a certain part in the game, they drop you into this open world. I would say about 80 to 85% of the game is just completely linear, like hallway linear with some puzzles thrown in there occasionally and you're fighting some enemies. But no, a few times you do actually go into this open world and you even drive. Once you get into the car, you have to make sure it's got the keys or you have to hotwire it. You can look around the car, mess with the radio, check the glove box for items, etc. The driving is very substandard and is very basic. Also, the world is going to shit around you, so don't expect smooth terrain. There is also the open world, which is Central Park. There's only 2 things actually to do in this open world. Go to the objective and burn these weird roots. There are these roots that sprout up all around the open world. You light these on fire to kill them. By doing this, Edward's eye ability gets stronger or some shit, because near the end of the game, the puzzles actually require Edward to close his eyes in order to see some weird light symbol, and then line up with his flashlight and this important item where he saw the symbol. Okay, well, hopefully I've made some sense of the gameplay, and it doesn't sound as confusing as I initially made it sound. The game is a lot. It has a lot of aspects, really, in terms of gameplay, and tries to do a lot of different things with varying degrees of success, but we will get to that soon enough. Let's talk about the presentation. The presentation in this game is questionable. There's some aspects that are decent, and there are some that are pretty bad. It's a mixed bag all around. Let's start with the character models. They are pretty lacking and don't look very good. They look like they're running on the Doom 3 engine, and that game came out 4 years before Alone in the Dark 2008. The detail is pretty low as a whole. Edward is decent enough, but everyone else is pretty lacking. The facial animations are hilariously bad, and they're just funny as a whole. The animations in general are not very good. They're rather stiff, look very cardboard-like, and are just not very good. Nothing looks smooth or natural, and everything is just so rigid. The fighting looks wonky as hell also. The models are not so hot. What is hot is the fire. Fire actually looks really well done in this game. I'm not gonna lie, it looks really good. And most games don't even have fire on this level in this day and age. And so the fire looks excellent. It just animates really realistically, spreads in an awesome looking way. Looks good. Unfortunately, the textures, they all look pretty last gen for the 360. They just look pretty basic. They're really muddy, really dirty and blurry a lot of the time with some pop in. They just don't have much detail and look pretty outdated even for 2008. A lot of the detail that is present looks pretty plastic. Even the lip syncing just looks plastic. Like I said, it looks pretty last gen, and it actually looks pretty similar to the original Gears of War in terms of textures, and that game came out years before this. Then there's the frame rate. The frame rate in this game is consistent for a good portion of the game, I will say that, but there are some times where it just comes down to a chugging halt. We're talking about 1 digit, and sometimes the game just literally freezes up and then continues. It's usually okay, but some of the parts of the game, like when you're driving, it just dies. Or loading a new area, the game just freezes up. It wasn't a major issue. You don't drive that much in the game, but as a whole, it was generally lacking. So like I said, the graphics, pretty mixed overall. It wasn't very good. Then we get to the sound, and the sound fares a little better. Alone in the Dark has always had excellent sound design. That's something the series has just had as a whole. And this game is actually okay. The music in the game is pretty decent. It's not totally generic crap you'll forget immediately. There is plenty of that in the game, but a number of the tracks are actually pretty memorable. And some of them that are all ancient sounding or a cappella, actually pretty good, I'm not gonna lie. Decently catchy. Not all of it was amazing or even okay, but there were a number of tracks that kind of surprised me, and I was like, wow, this isn't totally garbage. I expected just totally generic crap, and it wasn't that. And it actually sets the mood of the game decently well. Sound effects are okay. Most of them sound pretty generic, such as guns, explosions, the cars, etc. There really wasn't anything to comment on, but some of the sound effects in this game are just disgusting. Like, just sounding totally vile, which is probably what they were going for, so I guess it's good? The sound effects are just alright, I guess. Now we have the voice acting. I think this sums up the voice acting perfectly.
Now give me my stone!
I don't have your stone, and fuck you anyway.
The voice acting in tangent with the writing, it's just funny, cheesy, a bit generic, and it's just generally silly. Some of the writing is just ridiculously stupid in this game, and you would never find anyone saying some of these lines in this context. I'm not saying it has to be believable, but it at least has to try to make me take the game seriously if it's trying to be serious. The real standout in the game is Edward, if you couldn't tell, and anytime he swears, it's just hilarious.
And I'm losing my mind. I bet that was a fucking 10 on the Richter scale.
Look, I didn't tell you to come along.
Shut
you
up.
think it both of you. Hey, take it easy, Theophile. But let's just put the gun down, okay?
So I like Edward because he made me smile and laugh at just how generally stupid he sounds and how forced the swearing sounds, but everything else I thought was just extremely forgettable, generic, and just added nothing. I don't remember a single thing about the voice acting for any of the other characters. I just wanted to hear Edward talk and swear some more. Now, some games attempt to be edgy, and this game really attempts to be edgy, and it's just hilarious. But everyone else in this game that wasn't Edward was just a waste of time when it came to voice acting. There's just really nothing to comment on. I mean, it's like it tried, but the writing just shoots down any attempt that this could make. The voice acting is very questionable as a whole, minus Edward.
Use Edward.
Wait. Hey, hold this for me, okay?
What kind of artifact is this?
Who's there, Edward?
There's a soul inside.
This is Hermes, Sarah. He's the key. Don't ask me why.
Speaking of questionable, where did the game even go? Where? This game really has some questionable shit with it. Let's just dive right into it.
Besides the graphics, and besides the story, the gameplay has some issues as well. The blinking mechanic at the beginning of the game, like I mentioned, it sucks. The controls in this game are extremely cumbersome and clunky. I know that this is nothing new to Alone in the Dark, but come on. Turning feels terrible in this game, as when Edward turns his body, he also walks in that direction a little bit. It's like a mix of almost tank controls, but not. It's just extremely cumbersome. Edward moves at a pretty slow rate. Every action is delayed to an extent. It just doesn't feel natural, ever. When you pick up a weapon, it's terrible. Flicking the stick is such a stupid idea. The animations are not only terrible, but it's extremely just clunky and just doesn't work a lot of the time. You'll just be flicking the stick all over, but Edward will just not do the action you're trying to get him to do. It's just very unresponsive. Hitting enemies with it is just more than difficult, and it just doesn't feel satisfying at all. It's like, it feels like you're just barely getting through. It's just so slow, and it's just janky. It's some high-level jank. Knocking over doors in this game is just awful. They want you to use like a melee weapon, but it just doesn't work a lot of the time. I hit the door over and over with the melee weapon, sometimes for a minute straight. It just doesn't fall down. So I usually have to just go find an explosive bottle and blow it up because I can't open the door. Speaking of explosive bottles and just inventory management in general in this game, it's just extremely clunky. I'm obviously playing with a controller, and it's probably a lot smoother with the mouse, or at least I would think so, but it just feels very cumbersome. I never got used to it at all. It's just so slow to manage items in this game. It's unintuitive as hell, and it can be confusing to look at. Healing up with the medical spray is just a terrible idea, and it's implemented even worse. It breaks the flow of the game because you literally have to just stop moving and spray all your wounds. But item management inventory system as a whole, this entire system is just very poor. That interface just sucks. Next issue is the physics in the game. They're not very good. They frequently don't work how they should. The physics just go all over the place. The collision detection is just very questionable as a whole. The physics in general are just really unpolished, and I died quite a number of times just because they just weren't working right. Luckily, the checkpoints in the game are actually really good. The platforming is pretty terrible all around. It's just extremely janky, it's slow, it doesn't feel natural or smooth at all like Uncharted or even Infamous. The last thing to mention for the jank is the driving. The driving is just absolutely terrible in this game. Not only do the cars just control horribly, they're just sliding all over the place like they're on ice, but the environments that you drive the cars in are even worse. The car is it just doesn't control like how you would think. Sometimes it turns like crazy, or sometimes it turns on a dime, or not enough. It's not smooth, it's inconsistent, it's unresponsive, and the bottom line is it's just not fun to drive. Every time in this game I got in a car, I dreaded it, because it just wasn't fun. What really makes the driving worse, though, is that the car literally gets stuck on everything. A slightly elevated crack, car stops, gets stuck, or it's like lightly skidding off a tree, car stops, gets stuck, you gotta back up, you can't even slide past anything. No, you have to be you can't be touching anything. It's just extremely inconsistent. Like, when it comes to getting stuck on stuff, sometimes it gets stuck on parts of the environment you wouldn't think it will, sometimes it doesn't. It's just like even inconsistent terrain and the car gets stuck. The car gets stuck on like borderline everything, and that's not even an like exaggeration. It just gets stuck on everything. And the collision detection is just horrible in a vehicle. You find yourself frequently getting stuck on like everything because of just the poor terrain. And the collision detection just doesn't help you at all. Any of the missions where you have to move fast or get somewhere fast, good luck. Because you'll be doing just fine, then go over some hedge of grass wrong, and the car gets completely stuck, and you just stop and you have to restart. The open world is just awfully, and I mean awfully, implemented. Not only is it a pain in the ass and just terrible to drive around in because of the bad driving, there's nothing to do. The only thing that there is to do in the open world is to do the next objective or burn the roots. Now, near the end of the game tells you need to start burning these roots. Now, never have you needed to burn roots at all until the very end of the game. They literally tell you gotta burn like 70% of the roots in the game. And I hadn't done any up until that point, so because I was like, why would I want to do this shit? I just want to go on to the next part of the game. Well, no. They make you actually go around the open world and burn all the roots. Or at least, not all of them, but a lot of them. And it's to literally progress in the game. They actually put this up. And they put it up with a barrier. A literal light barrier. Like, it's just very blatant padding. It's some of the most blatant padding I've ever seen in a video game, actually. It adds maybe another like 2.5 hours to the game of just going around the open world burning the roots. I mean, it just wasn't fun at all. The game overall was like 10 hours long, and this added like another 2 hours total. So it was like, this really is padding. It sucks, it was not fun, and I hated it. And I'll tell you what this game's biggest issue is, honestly. If you couldn't tell, like when I was explaining the gameplay, this game tries to do way too much. It's just overly ambitious on every front, and it basically fails in every aspect. They just couldn't stick to one gameplay style. The game is just way too ambitious for its own good. I mean, that entire TV series with episodes in the previously on Alone in the Dark that I brought up at the very beginning of the review, like, it just totally falls flat in this game. Like, it falls flat on its face, and it cuts out at the most inconvenient times and really hurts the pacing more than anything else, and it's just not well implemented, honestly. The game tries way too much with its survival elements, trying to get rid of the HUD, multiple control schemes, multiple camera angles, Uncharted-style platforming, really like an empty open world, and terrible driving mechanics. Instead of focusing on maybe like 1 or 2 gameplay styles and perfecting those, or at least making those good, they instead just throw all the shit at the wall and they see what sticks. And I'll be honest, the only thing that sticks in this game is the fire mechanics. They are probably the best aspect of the game. Everything else has either a glaring issue that borderlines ruins it, or it just has a bunch of little issues that also make it not very good. Literally every aspect of the gameplay, it just absolutely, totally falls apart. I think it's the best way to describe Alone in the Dark 2008. It is a game that just absolutely falls apart. It tries to do way too much in every aspect. It tries to have a grand story, all these interesting gameplay mechanics, and well, the game sucks. It's considered one of the worst reboots of any series and is a prime example of how you don't reboot a game series. Did the game have any potential? I guess, maybe, probably not though, not with that storyline. I honestly think the game was severely rushed as well just to get the game out. I mean, look at all the bugs and how janky it is. So when the original game came out, it came out on PS2, Wii, 360, and PC, but not PS3. See, it came out 6 months later on the PS3, and this version of the game is called Alone in the Dark Inferno, and apparently fixes some of the issues I had with this game, specifically the driving, the interface, and a lot of the bugs. So that literally leads me to believe that this game was just rushed out the door. And while I was originally going to play the PS3 version of the game, I can tell you it costs about 4 times more than the 360 copy, and I was just not willing to spend that for this game. Sorry, I'm a broke college student. I'm not paying that much for this piece of shit. But for some reason, if you really want to play this game, the PS3 version is definitely the best version to play.
So, in conclusion, Alone in the Dark 2008 really is a piece of shit. It's got just borderline terrible gameplay. It tries to do so many things and just falls apart. It's got a hilariously bad story, really funny dialogue, and is just generally a pretty bad game and not a fun experience. If you actually like this game and think it was like a good reboot or even a decent game, I really have to ask why. So luckily, after this piece of crap reboot by Atari, the Alone in the Dark franchise was spared from any more atrocities, and there wouldn't be any more games, and they just leave its legacy alone. Yeah, that didn't happen. There's actually one more game.
Okay, so there was one more Alone in the Dark game, known as Alone in the Dark Illumination, released a few years ago only on the PC. The game doesn't get a full review because I only played about an hour of it, and that was all I needed to play. Most people don't even bring the game up when talking about Alone in the Dark at this point because this game is just awful. I'll be honest, I'd even take the 2008 reboot over this game, and that's saying something. This is one of the jankiest games I've ever played. I mean it. It makes the other game, the 2008 game, look fine. This game glitches out like crazy and crashed on me multiple times. It's a terrible Left 4 Dead style co-op shooter where it is nothing to do with Alone in the Dark at all, and it's a bad game in its own right. The series is literally called Alone in the Dark. Why is it a co-op game? Hello, you're supposed to be alone. Like, really. Even on its own, if you take the Alone in the Dark name from it, it's just terrible. The shooting feels horrible, the objectives are just borderline confusing, the maps are terrible and bland, the graphics are awful, and it just feels completely generic and devoid of any soul. It's also completely dead, which for a co-op game that's not good. The game is an avoid at all costs game, and I'm getting my money back. I actually already have. Okay, so now for the real in conclusion. Alone in the Dark, the series, has a really shaky track record, with an amazing first game, 2 pretty mediocre sequels, a good 4th game that re-established the series, and then a piece of shit reboot and an even worse co-op shooter. The series is totally dead now. It wasn't a one-trick pony, but it almost was. As the game series that created survival horror, it's scary how many of these games are bad in the series.
So yeah, Alone in the Dark, I really hope in the future it's just kind of left alone in the dark. We don't really need any more of this series. I think the legacy's already been tarnished enough. Please just leave it alone. The series was sold from Atari to THQ Nordic, who actually re-released the original 3 games on Steam, the versions I played. And THQ Nordic loves to remake games. They got SpongeBob and Destroy All Humans. Maybe a remake of the original Alone in the Dark would be pretty cool, actually. But other than that, please just leave it alone. Maybe even a re-release of like New Nightmare on like modern consoles. But we don't need any more Alone in the Dark. But on that note, this is where we conclude Alone in the Dark. So, thank you guys for watching. I hope you've enjoyed me looking at these games. It was definitely interesting, that's for sure. And I was quite surprised, honestly, with my entire look at of these games. I didn't expect to dislike them so much, but that's just the way the cookie crumbles. If you like the video, you can give it a thumbs up or a thumbs down. Either way, I think it works with the YouTube algorithm or some crap. Commenting would be the best, though. I love reading your guys' comments, and I will always reply. And subscribe if you haven't already. Do I need to say the stupid bell thing? I shouldn't. You know how it works. Anyway, I got a Twitter. You should follow that. And thank you guys for everything. Now, see you guys on Halloween.